Chapter 1. The Weight of Gold and Green. Harry could have stayed in bed that morning. The thought crossed his mind as he stood in the center of the Gryffindor locker room, watching his teammates pull on their scarlet and gold robes with the kind of nervous energy that made the air feel electric. He could have claimed illness, could have let McLaggen captain the team for this match against Slytherin. It would have been so beautifully simple. A headache, a stomach bug, anything that would have kept him warm beneath his four-poster bed instead of standing here, feeling the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. But that was the thing about being Harry Potter. There was always a choice, and there was never really a choice at all. "Right then," he said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. The locker room fell silent, 6 faces turning toward him, with expressions that ranged from eager anticipation to barely concealed terror. Katie Bell caught his eye and gave him a small nod, her dark hair already braided back in the practical style she preferred for matches. She'd been doing that braid the same way since second year, Harry realized, with the kind of oddly specific observation that his mind latched onto when he was trying not to think about more pressing concerns. Like how this was potentially Katie's last match if they lost today. "We've trained for this," Harry continued, pushing the thought away. "We know their plays, we know their weaknesses, and we bloody well know we're the better team." A few nervous laughs answered him, and he felt some of the tension in the room ease. "Bell, Johnson's been favoring her left side since that bludger hit in practice. Make her work to her right. Spin it. Keep an eye on Crabbe. He's been aiming high all season, trying to take heads off instead of playing properly." Alicia nodded sharply, her jaw set in the determined line Harry had come to associate with imminent violence on the Quidditch pitch. Good. They'd need that today. "McLaggen, Thomas," Harry turned to his beaters, trying not to wince at having to rely on McLaggen for anything important. "Their Seeker's going to try the Wronski feint at least twice. I need you to make sure I'm not nursing a broken neck when he does." "Course, Harry," Dean said easily, hefting his bat with practiced confidence. McLaggen just grunted, which Harry supposed was about as much enthusiasm as he could expect. "And me?" Ron asked, his freckles standing out starkly against his pale face. The poor bastard looked like he was about to be sick, which wasn't exactly inspiring confidence in their keeper. "You," Harry said, meeting his best friend's worried gaze, "are going to be brilliant. Same as always." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Ron had been struggling all season, his confidence shattered by years of living in his brother's shadows and a summer of watching his sister date other people while he pretended not to care. But sometimes, Harry thought, a lie told with enough conviction could become the truth. At least for 90 minutes. The walk to the pitch felt both endless and far too short. Harry's boots crunched against the frost-hard ground, his breath forming small clouds in the November air that dispersed almost immediately in the wind. The Gryffindor supporters were out in force, their scarlet banners snapping like battle flags in the breeze, their voices carrying across the grounds in a chaos of songs and chants that should have been comforting. Instead, Harry found himself cataloguing the Slytherin section, noting how many parents had made the journey to watch their children play, how many former students had returned for what everyone knew was shaping up to be the match of the season. No pressure, then. The changing room was a blur of last-minute adjustments and nervous energy. Harry pulled on his gloves, flexed his fingers around his firebolt, and tried to ignore the way his stomach had decided to attempt a series of complicated acrobatic maneuvers that would have impressed even the Weird Sisters. This was just Quidditch. Just a game. Just the thing he'd been doing since he was 11 years old, the thing that had always made sense when nothing else in his life did. Except today somehow. It felt different, heavier. "Captains, shake hands!" Madam Hooch called, her yellow eyes fixed on Harry and Malfoy as they approached each other in the center of the pitch. The Slytherin captain looked insufferably pleased with himself, his pale hair gleaming in the weak autumn sunlight, his cold grey eyes holding that familiar mixture of contempt and anticipation that Harry had learned to despise over the years. Potter," Malfoy said, his voice carrying just loudly enough for the nearest spectators to hear. "Try not to fall off your broom when we crush you." "Malfoy," Harry replied pleasantly, gripping the other boy's hand perhaps a bit more firmly than strictly necessary. "Try not to cry when you lose to a bunch of blood traitors and mudbloods." Malfoy's eyes flashed, but before he could respond, Madame Hooch was releasing the balls and mounting her broom, her whistle poised at her lips. Harry kicked off hard, rising into the air with the familiar rush of freedom that always accompanied flight, and for a moment, just a moment, everything felt right again. The quaffle was released, and the match began. It started well, better than well. Gryffindor took possession immediately, Katie and Alicia working together with the kind of seamless precision that came from years of playing side by side, passing the quaffle back and forth as they advanced on the Slytherin goalposts. Harry circled high above the action, his eyes scanning for any flash of gold while simultaneously keeping track of the game below. Ron made a spectacular save in the first 5 minutes, diving to his left to knock away a shot from Urquhart that should have been a certain goal, and the Gryffindor stands erupted in cheers. Maybe they actually had a chance. 20 minutes in, Gryffindor led 30-10, and Harry was beginning to allow himself the dangerous luxury of optimism. Katie had scored twice, her shots clean and precise, threading the needle between the keeper and the left-hand post with the kind of accuracy that made Quidditch look easy. Alicia had added another, and even McLaggen and Thomas seemed to be working well together, keeping the Slytherin chasers honest and protecting Ron from the worst of the incoming fire. Harry caught sight of the snitch twice, once hovering near the Ravenclaw stands, apparently fascinated by Luna Lovegood's lion-shaped hat, and once making lazy circles around the commentator's booth, where Lee Jordan was providing his usual enthusiastic and utterly biased coverage of the match. Both times, Malfoy was too far away to be a threat, and Harry let it fly free rather than risk ending the match while Gryffindor held such a comfortable lead. That was his first mistake. The second came 5 minutes later, when he spotted the snitch again, this time hovering at head height near the Slytherin goalposts, its wings beating frantically, as if it were considering making a break for freedom. Harry leaned forward on his firebolt, feeling the familiar thrill of the hunt as he began his descent. Malfoy had seen it too, but he was on the far side of the pitch, and Harry had the angle and the faster broom. He should have been watching the beaters. The bludger caught him square in the shoulder, a bone-jarring impact that sent him spinning sideways on his broom, his right arm going completely numb. He fought to maintain control, gasping as feeling returned in a rush of pins and needles, but by the time he'd straightened himself out, Malfoy was already diving, his pale hand outstretched toward the struggling snitch. "No," Harry whispered, kicking his broom into the fastest dive he'd ever attempted. The wind tore at his robes, brought tears to his eyes, made it almost impossible to see, but he could just make out the blur of Malfoy's form ahead of him, reaching. Malfoy's fingers closed around the snitch, and the whistle blew. Slytherin, 160, Gryffindor, 140. The silence that followed was somehow worse than any amount of jeering would have been. Harry pulled up from his dive, hovering in the center of the pitch as the reality of what had just happened settled over him like a physical weight. Around him, his teammates were landing with the shell-shocked expressions of soldiers who'd just watched their battlefield slip away, and in the stands, the Gryffindor section had gone quiet except for a few scattered voices calling out encouragement that sounded hollow and desperate. "Good match, Potter," Malfoy said, floating past with the kind of satisfied smirk that Harry wanted to hex right off his face. "Maybe next year you'll actually catch the thing." Next year. The words hit Harry like another bludger, because of course there wasn't going to be a next year, not for Katie or Alicia, not for any of the 7th years who'd just played their last match for Gryffindor. He looked around for Katie, found her sitting motionless on her broom near the center circle, staring down at her hands with an expression that was somehow worse than tears. They landed in a cluster near the changing rooms, boots hitting the ground with dull thuds that seemed too loud in the sudden quiet. Harry wanted to say something, anything, that might take away the hollow look in his teammates' eyes, but every word that came to mind sounded pathetic and useless. "We played well," he managed finally, and even to his own ears it sounded like the lie it was. "Not well enough," Katie said quietly, pulling off her gloves with mechanical precision. She looked up at him for a moment, and Harry saw something in her dark eyes that made his chest tight. Not anger, not even disappointment, just a kind of resigned sadness that was somehow infinitely worse. "Katie, it's all right, Harry," she said, and the gentle way she said it made him feel like the worst kind of failure. "Really, we all did our best." But that was just it, wasn't it? They had done their best, and it hadn't been good enough. Harry had done his best, and it hadn't been good enough. The snitch had been right there, practically begging to be caught, and he'd let himself get distracted by a bludger that he should have seen coming from a mile away. The changing room was a tomb. His teammates moved through the motions of removing their gear with the slow, careful movements of people in shock, and Harry found himself wishing desperately that one of them would shout at him, blame him, do anything other than accept this defeat with such quiet dignity. "Right," Ron said finally, breaking the silence as he pulled his gloves off with hands that shook only slightly. "Fancy a butterbeer? My treat." There were murmurs of agreement, half-hearted but genuine, and gradually the team began to drift toward the door. Katie was among the last to leave, pausing as she passed Harry's bench. "Coming?" she asked. Harry looked down at his Quidditch robes, still draped across his lap, and shook his head. "In a bit. Just need a moment." She hesitated, and for a second Harry thought she might stay, might push the issue, but then she nodded and followed the others out. The door swung shut behind them with a soft click, leaving Harry alone with the weight of his failure and the smell of old leather and lingering nerves that always hung around the changing rooms after a match. He could have caught it. That was the thing that kept circling around in his head, like a curse he couldn't break. If he'd been faster, if he'd been more careful, if he'd been better, he could have caught the snitch before Malfoy even got close. Katie and Alicia would have gone out as champions instead of also Rans. Ron would have had his moment of triumph, and the Gryffindor stands would still be singing instead of filing out in disappointed silence. Instead, he'd failed them, all of them. Harry stood up abruptly, his robes falling to the floor in a scarlet and gold heap. He needed air, needed space, needed to be anywhere but in this room full of reminders of how badly he'd let everyone down. The corridors of Hogwarts stretched out before him, filled with students making their way to the Great Hall for dinner, their voices bright with discussion of the match, and Harry found himself taking turns at random, walking faster and faster until he was almost running, trying to outpace the voice in his head that kept repeating the same thing over and over. "You failed them. You failed them. You failed them." He ended up in the abandoned section of the castle, in corridors that hadn't seen regular use in decades, where the portraits slept in their frames and dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. His footsteps echoed off the stone walls, a lonely sound that matched the hollow feeling in his chest, and when he finally stopped walking, he wasn't entirely sure where he was. There was a classroom nearby, its door standing slightly ajar, and Harry pushed it open without really thinking about what he was doing. It was empty, as he'd expected, filled with broken desks and chairs covered in dust sheets that looked like ghosts in the dim light. He sat down heavily on one of the few intact chairs and put his head in his hands. The silence was absolute. No cheering crowds, no teammates offering consolation, no well-meaning friends trying to convince him that it didn't matter, that there would be other matches, other chances. Just Harry and the weight of his failure and the growing certainty that he was exactly what the Daily Prophet had always claimed he was. A fraud, a boy playing at being a hero, someone who'd gotten lucky a few times and convinced the world he was something special. The tears came without warning, hot and sudden, and completely beyond his control. Harry pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, trying to force them back, but they kept coming anyway, Months of pressure and responsibility, and the terrible weight of everyone's expectations finally finding their outlet. He cried for Katie and Alicia and their lost final season. He cried for Ron, who'd played brilliantly and would still blame himself for the loss. He cried for his parents, who'd died believing he was worth saving, and for Sirius, who'd died because Harry had been too proud and too stupid to think clearly. He cried because he was 17 years old and tired of being responsible for everyone else's happiness, tired of being the boy who lived when all he really wanted was to be the boy who got to sleep in. On Saturday morning, most of all, he cried because he was alone. Not just here, in this forgotten classroom in the depths of the castle, but everywhere, always. Even surrounded by friends and teammates and admirers, there was a part of him that remained separate, untouchable, defined by the scar on his forehead and the expectations that came with it. The tears tasted like salt and failure, and Harry let them fall until his eyes burned and his throat was raw and there was nothing left inside him but emptiness. Outside, somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint sounds of the castle settling in for evening. Footsteps in corridors, doors closing, the low murmur of conversation drifting up from the great hall, where his friends were probably wondering where he'd gone. Let them wonder. Let them think he was off sulking somewhere, or plotting revenge against Malfoy, or doing any of the 100 things that people expected Harry Potter to do after a defeat. The truth was so much simpler and so much more pathetic. He was sitting alone in a dusty classroom, crying like a child because he'd let down the people who mattered most to him. The door creaked softly, and Harry's head snapped up, his heart jumping into his throat. He wiped frantically at his eyes, trying to erase the evidence of his breakdown, but it was too late. Someone was there, standing in the doorway, and Harry was about to become the subject of yet another round of whispered gossip about the great Harry Potter's moment of weakness. "Harry!" The voice was soft, hesitant, and utterly unexpected. Katie Bell stepped into the room, her dark eyes wide with concern, her Gryffindor scarf still wrapped around her neck from the match. She looked like she'd been searching for him, like she'd walked through half the castle to find him here in his moment of complete and utter humiliation. Harry opened his mouth to speak, to make some excuse or deflect with humor the way he always did, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat there in the dusty chair, his face still wet with tears, staring at Katie Bell and wondering how his day had managed to get even worse. "I was looking for you," she said quietly, stepping further into the room and closing the door behind her. "I went back to get my wrist guards from the changing room, and I thought I might find you here. Here, in the abandoned section of the castle where failures came to hide from the world." Harry let out a shaky laugh that sounded more like a sob, and Katie's expression grew even more concerned. "Harry, are you all right?" The question was so absurd, so completely at odds with his current state, that Harry nearly started crying again. All right? He'd just lost the most important match of the season, destroyed his teammates' last chance at glory, and been discovered weeping like a child in a dusty classroom by the one person who had the most right to hate him for it. "No," he said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "No, I'm not all right." Katie moved closer, her footsteps careful on the dusty floor, and Harry braced himself for her anger, her disappointment, her perfectly justified blame. Instead, she sat down on the floor in front of his chair, looking up at him with those dark eyes that held nothing but kindness. "Neither am I," she said simply, and somehow, impossibly, that made everything just a little bit better. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Armor. Harry stared at Katie Bell, sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor of the abandoned classroom, her scarlet and gold scarf still wrapped around her neck like armor she'd forgotten to remove. The late afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows cast strange shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion in her dark eyes, The way her usually perfect posture had collapsed into something smaller, more human. "Neither am I," she'd said, and the words hung in the air between them like a confession neither of them had been prepared to make. Harry wiped at his face again, though he suspected there was little point. His eyes felt swollen and raw, his cheeks still wet with the kind of tears that left tracks, and there was no hiding what Katy had walked in on. The great Harry Potter, reduced to sobbing in a dusty classroom because he'd missed a snitch. It would be all over the castle by morning, assuming Katy bothered to tell anyone, which she probably wouldn't, because that was the kind of person she was. Decent. Kind. Better than he deserved. "I forgot my wrist guards," Katy said quietly, as if she needed to explain her presence here, in this forgotten corner of the castle where failures came to hide. "In the changing room. I went back for them, but—" She trailed off, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her scarf. "I heard someone crying. I thought it might be Ron, actually. He's been taking losses pretty hard this season." The assumption that it would be Ron rather than Harry should have stung, but instead it felt oddly comforting. Of course, she'd assumed it was Ron. Ron was allowed to break down after matches, allowed to show emotion and vulnerability, without the entire wizarding world deciding it meant something profound about the state of their collective future. Ron was human in ways that Harry had never been permitted to be. "I'm sorry," Harry said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. "For losing the match. For letting everyone down. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the evidence of his complete emotional collapse. "For this." Katy was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "You know, my parents came to watch today." Harry blinked, thrown by the apparent non sequitur. "What?" "My parents," Katy repeated, pulling her knees up to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. "They drove up from London this morning. Dad took the day off work, which he never does. Mum made sandwiches and packed them in her good basket, the one she only uses for special occasions." She let out a shaky laugh. They were so excited. Dad kept going on about how this was going to be the match where his daughter finally won the cup, how he'd been waiting 6 years to see Gryffindor beat Slytherin in the final. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Katy. And the thing is," she continued as if he hadn't spoken, "I knew we were going to lose. Not because of you. Not because of anything anyone did wrong, but because that's just how it goes sometimes. You can train and prepare and want something so badly it physically hurts, and sometimes it's still not enough." She was looking at him now, really looking at him, and Harry found himself unable to look away. There was something in her eyes that he'd never noticed before, a kind of quiet understanding that made his chest feel tight. "I've been playing Quidditch since I was 7 years old," Katy said. "Started on a youth team in my neighborhood. Dad signed me up because I kept stealing his old clean sweep and flying it around the garden when I thought no one was looking. I've been dreaming of winning the Hogwarts Cup since I was 12, and Oliver Wood first told me what it meant to play for Gryffindor. And you know what I realized today, sitting on my broom after Malfoy caught the snitch?" Harry shook his head, not trusting his voice. "I realized that somewhere along the way, the dream stopped being about me winning the cup and started being about not disappointing everyone else. My parents, who drove up from London and packed sandwiches in their good basket. My teammates, who've been working just as hard as I have. The house, who've been cheering for us all season." She let out another laugh, this one even shakier than the first. "Even you, actually. I kept thinking about how awful you'd feel if we lost, how much you'd blame yourself, and I couldn't bear the thought of being the reason you looked the way you look right now." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. "Katy, no. You didn't. You played brilliantly today. You scored twice. You were perfect. I was adequate," Katy interrupted gently. "I did my job." But adequate wasn't enough. And perfect wouldn't have been either, because sometimes the other team just wants it more. Sometimes the bludger hits at exactly the wrong moment. Sometimes the snitch decides to hover right where your opponent can reach it first. Harry stared at her, feeling something shift inside his chest. How are you so calm about this? Katie was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes distant. Because I've been where you are right now. After the match against Ravenclaw last year, when I missed that shot in the final minute that would have put us through to the final. I went back to my dormitory and cried for 3 hours straight. Alicia found me eventually, brought me chocolate, and sat with me while I listed all the ways I'd failed everyone who'd ever believed in me. What did she say? She told me I was being an idiot, Katie said with a small smile. Said that if I thought the entire fate of Gryffindor Quidditch rested on one shot, then I had a pretty inflated sense of my own importance. Said the team won and lost together, not because of any one person's mistakes. Harry felt his throat tighten. She was right. She was right, Katie agreed, but it took me months to really believe it. And even now, part of me wonders if I could have done something different, been something better. She looked at him directly, and Harry saw his own exhaustion reflected in her eyes. The difference is, I'm not the boy who lived. When I fail, it's just Katie Bell having a bad day. When you fail, the whole world decides it means something, Harry finished quietly. Exactly. Katie shifted slightly, settling more comfortably against the stone wall behind her. I can't imagine what that's like. Having every mistake dissected by people who don't know you, who think they understand what you're going through because they've read about you in the Prophet. It must be incredibly lonely. The word hit him like a curse. Lonely. Yes, that was exactly what it was. What it had always been. Harry had friends, more friends than he'd ever expected to have. People who cared about him and would fight beside him without question. But there was always that distance, that sense that he was fundamentally separate from everyone else, by virtue of his scar and his history, and the expectations that came with both. It is, he admitted, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. It's so bloody lonely sometimes I can barely breathe. Katie nodded, as if she'd expected as much. I used to wonder, you know, what it would be like to be you, to have people know your name, before you even introduced yourself, to have everyone assume you're special, just because of something that happened when you were a baby. She tilted her head, studying him. I don't wonder anymore. Why not? Because I've watched you for 6 years now, in classes, at meals, during matches. And you know what I've realized? You're not special because of your scar, or because you survived you know who. You're special because you care so much about everyone else that you'd rather break yourself than let them down. Harry felt tears prick at his eyes again, but this time they felt different, cleaner somehow. I don't feel special. I feel like a fraud most of the time. Good, Katie said firmly. The moment you start believing your own legend is the moment you stop being worth believing in. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the dusty classroom around them forgotten. Harry found himself really looking at Katie for what felt like the first time. Not Katie Bell the chaser. Not Katie Bell the teammate. But Katie Bell the person. She had small hands, he noticed, though they looked strong from years of gripping a quaffle. Her hair was escaping from its post-match braid, curling slightly around her face in a way that softened her features. There was a small scar on her chin that he'd never noticed before, probably from a childhood accident that had nothing to do with Quidditch or magic, or the war that was slowly creeping closer to all of them. Can I ask you something? Harry said finally. Of course. Why did you come looking for me? I mean, really? You could have gotten your wrist guards tomorrow. Katie was quiet for so long that Harry began to think she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and a little uncertain. Because I know what it's like to carry too much weight. And because—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Because I've been watching you carry it alone for 6 years, and I thought maybe it was time someone offered to help." The simple honesty of it nearly undid him. Harry had to look away, focusing on a water stain on the wall that looked vaguely like a dragon, blinking hard against the fresh wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I don't know how to let people help," he admitted. "Every time I do, someone gets hurt. Sirius died because I was too proud to listen to people who knew better than me. Ginny nearly died because I didn't protect her well enough. I keep thinking, if I just carry everything myself, if I just don't let anyone else get too close." "Then you'll what?" Katie asked gently. "Save everyone by destroying yourself. How is that better?" "Because if I'm the only one who gets hurt—" "You're not the only one who gets hurt," Katie interrupted, and there was something sharp in her voice now, an edge that made Harry look at her. "You're hurting right now, and it's hurting me to watch. It's hurting Ron and Hermione too, even if they don't know how to say it. When you punish yourself for things that aren't your fault, you're not protecting us. You're just making us watch someone we care about suffer." Harry opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was something in Katie's expression that reminded him uncomfortably of Hermione when she was building up to one of her lectures, except softer somehow. Less like being scolded and more like being seen. "I never thought of it that way," he said finally. "Of course you didn't. You're 17, and you've been carrying the weight of the world since you were 11. Nobody taught you how to share the load, because nobody expected you to live long enough to need to know." Katie's voice gentled again. "But you're still here, Harry. You're still alive, and you're going to keep being alive, and that means you need to figure out how to live with other people instead of just for them." The words settled over him like a blanket, warm and heavy and strangely comforting. Harry had spent so many years focused on survival, his own, his friends', the wizarding world's, that he'd never really considered what came after. What life looked like when the immediate threat was gone, when he was allowed to be something other than a weapon pointed at Voldemort. "I don't know how," he admitted. "Neither do I," Katie said with a small smile. "But maybe we could figure it out together." The offer hung in the air between them, simple and terrifying and full of possibilities Harry had never allowed himself to consider. He looked at Katie, really looked at her, and saw not just understanding, but acceptance. She'd seen him at his lowest, his most pathetic, and she was still here, still offering friendship, companionship, something he couldn't quite name but desperately wanted. "Why?" he asked, the question coming out rougher than he'd intended. "Why would you want to do that?" Katie was quiet for a moment, her fingers still fidgeting with her scarf. "Because I think we're more alike than either of us realized. Because I think you need a friend who doesn't see you as the boy who lived, and I think I need a friend who doesn't see me as just another Gryffindor chaser." She looked at him directly, and Harry saw something vulnerable in her dark eyes. "Because I've been feeling pretty lonely too, and maybe we could be lonely together until we figure out how not to be." The honesty of it took his breath away. Here was Katie Bell, who seemed so put together, so confident, admitting that she struggled with the same isolation that plagued him. It should have been impossible. Katie had friends, teammates, a family who drove up from London to watch her play. But somehow Harry understood. There was a difference between being surrounded by people and being truly known by them, between being appreciated for what you could do and being accepted for who you were. "I'd like that," Harry said quietly. "I'd really like that." Katie's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and bright enough to chase away the shadows that had been gathering in the corners of the dusty classroom. "Good. That's really good." They looked at each other in the growing dusk, and Harry felt something shift inside his chest. Not the sharp, desperate affection he'd felt for Cho, or the confused tangle of guilt and protection that coloured his feelings for Ginny, but something steadier, calmer, like coming home after a long journey to find that someone had left the lights on and was waiting for him. "We should probably head back," Katie said eventually, though she made no move to get up. "People will be wondering where we've gone." "Let them wonder," Harry said, surprising himself with the words. "I'm not ready to go back to being Harry Potter yet." Katie laughed, a real laugh this time, rich and warm and completely unself-conscious. "Fair enough, but I should warn you, I'm absolutely starving. Missing dinner to have emotional breakthroughs is all very romantic in novels, but in real life it just makes me cranky." The casual mention of romance made Harry's cheeks warm, though he wasn't entirely sure why. "We could raid the kitchens. I know the way." "Of course you do," Katie said, rolling her eyes fondly. "Is there anywhere in this castle you haven't been?" "The girls' dormitories," Harry said automatically, then felt his face go even redder as Katie burst into giggles. "Well, that's a relief. I'd hate to think I was having a heart-to-heart with a peeping Tom." "I'm not. That's not—" Harry spluttered, but Katie was still laughing, and the sound was so infectious that he found himself smiling despite his embarrassment. "I know you're not," she said gently, her laughter subsiding. "I was just teasing. You're far too much of a gentleman to be anything like that." Harry wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he didn't. Instead, he stood up and offered Katie his hand, pulling her to her feet when she took it. Her fingers were smaller than his, but strong, calloused from years of Quidditch, and they lingered in his grip for just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For staying, for listening, for not thinking I'm pathetic for crying over a Quidditch match." Katie squeezed his hand gently before letting go. "Harry James Potter, you are many things. Stubborn, reckless, occasionally insufferable. But you are not pathetic. You're human. And there's nothing wrong with being human, even when the rest of the world wants you to be something else." The use of his full name should have felt strange coming from her, but instead it felt oddly intimate, like a secret they were sharing, a way of acknowledging who he was beneath all the mythology and expectation. "Come on," Katie said, smoothing down her robes and checking her appearance in the grimy window. "Let's go find those kitchens. And Harry?" "Yeah. Next time you need to fall apart, you don't have to do it alone. All right?" Harry felt his throat tighten again, but this time the sensation was warm rather than painful. "All right." They walked out of the abandoned classroom together, leaving behind the dust and shadows and the weight of the afternoon's defeat. The corridors of Hogwarts stretched out before them, familiar and welcoming in the gathering dusk, and for the first time in longer than Harry could remember, he didn't feel like he was walking them alone. Behind them, the door swung shut with a soft click, sealing away the last traces of their conversation. But the understanding they'd found in that forgotten room, the recognition of kindred spirits, the beginning of something neither of them had expected, that travelled with them into the warm light of the castle, as real and solid as the stones beneath their feet. Tomorrow, Harry would still be the boy who lived. He would still carry the weight of prophecy and expectation, and a war that was growing closer every day. But tonight, he was just Harry, walking beside Katie toward the promise of food and friendship, and the radical idea that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry everything alone. And that, Harry thought, as Katie launched into a story about her disastrous attempt at baking in the Gryffindor common room the week before, was more than enough to be getting on with. Chapter 3. Small Conversations. Harry woke the next morning with the strange sensation that something fundamental had shifted in his world, though it took him several moments of staring at the scarlet hangings around his bed to remember what it was. Katie. The abandoned classroom. The conversation that had somehow managed to crack something open inside his chest that he hadn't even realized was sealed shut. The memory of it should have made him cringe with embarrassment. Crying in front of a teammate, spilling his deepest fears to someone he barely knew, accepting comfort he'd spent years convincing himself he didn't need. Instead, as Harry pushed back his covers and reached for his glasses, he found himself thinking about the way Katie had looked at him in that dusty room. Not with pity or awkward discomfort, but with understanding, as if his breakdown had been the most natural thing in the world. "You're up early," Ron mumbled from the next bed, his voice thick with sleep. "Match hangover keeping you awake?" "Something like that," Harry said, though it wasn't entirely true. He'd actually slept better than he had in weeks, his dreams filled not with the usual nightmares of green light and cold laughter, but with quiet conversations and warm brown eyes, and the radical idea that maybe he didn't have to carry everything alone. The great hall was half empty when Harry made his way down for breakfast, most of the castle still sleeping off the previous day's match. He found himself scanning the Gryffindor table almost without thinking, looking for a familiar head of dark hair, though he wasn't entirely sure what he would say to Katie when he found her. Their conversation in the abandoned classroom had felt momentous in the moment, but in the harsh light of morning, Harry wondered if it might seem different to her. Less significant. Maybe even a mistake. He needn't have worried. Katie appeared at his elbow just as he was reaching for the marmalade, her hair still damp from a shower, and her robes slightly wrinkled, as if she'd dressed in a hurry. "Morning," she said, settling onto the bench beside him, with the kind of casual ease that suggested nothing had changed between them, even though everything had. "Morning," Harry replied, acutely aware of the way her shoulder brushed against his as she reached for the toast. "Sleep well?" "Better than I expected, actually." Katie glanced at him sideways, and Harry caught the hint of a smile playing around the corners of her mouth. "I kept thinking about what you said yesterday, about not knowing how to let people help." Harry felt his cheeks warm. In the light of day, his confessions seemed almost impossibly intimate. "Katie, I have a proposition for you," she interrupted gently, spreading jam on her toast with careful precision. "I've got ancient runes homework that's making me want to set fire to my textbook, and I seem to remember you mentioning that you struggle with it too. Want to suffer through it together?" The invitation was casual, almost offhand, but Harry heard the deeper offer beneath it. A chance to continue what they'd started yesterday. A way to let someone help without making it feel like charity or pity. "I'd like that," he said, surprised by how much he meant it. "Though I should warn you, my ancient runes is appalling. You might end up carrying me through the whole assignment." "Good thing I've got strong shoulders," Katie said lightly, then paused, her eyes widening slightly, as if she'd only just heard what she'd said. A faint blush crept up her neck, and Harry found himself fighting back a smile. "Right," he said, enjoying the way her blush deepened. "Strong shoulders. Very practical for Quidditch." "Exactly," Katie said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Very practical. Nothing to do with anything else." They looked at each other for a moment, both clearly aware that they were being ridiculous, before Katie burst into giggles and Harry found himself laughing too. It felt good, this easy humor between them, natural in a way that Harry's interactions with people rarely were. "Library after lunch?" Katie asked once she'd composed herself. "Library after lunch," Harry agreed. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of potions, where Slughorn spent far too much time praising Harry's latest batch of strengthening solution, and defense against the dark arts, where Snape's substitute continued to prove that she was vastly underqualified for the position. Harry found himself thinking about Katie more than was probably appropriate, remembering the way her eyes had lit up when she laughed, the way she'd said his name like it was something precious, rather than a burden. By the time lunch arrived, he was practically vibrating with nervous energy. This was ridiculous, he told himself, as he made his way to the Great Hall. It was just study partners, just two friends helping each other with homework. The fact that one of those friends happened to be a girl he was beginning to realize he'd never properly looked at before was irrelevant. Completely irrelevant. Katie was already waiting for him at the Gryffindor table, a small stack of books beside her plate, and an expression of grim determination on her face. "I've been looking ahead at the homework," she announced as Harry sat down. "I think Professor Babbling might actually be trying to kill us." "What makes you say that?" Harry asked, reaching for the shepherd's pie. "She wants us to translate 3 paragraphs of Old Norse runic poetry," Katie said, holding up a piece of parchment covered in symbols that looked more like decorative squiggles than actual writing. "Poetry, Harry. As if regular Old Norse wasn't impossible enough." Harry squinted at the parchment, feeling his stomach sink as he recognized exactly none of the symbols. "Right. Well, that's definitely challenging." "You have no idea what any of this says, do you?" Katie asked, though her tone was more amused than accusing. "Not a clue," Harry admitted. "I can usually muddle through the basic stuff, but poetry... I might as well try to translate dolphin songs." Katie laughed, the sound bright and infectious. "Dolphin songs might actually be easier. At least dolphins don't use archaic grammatical structures." They finished lunch quickly and made their way to the library, where Madame Pince directed them to a table near the back, with the kind of disapproving look she reserved for students she suspected of planning to cause trouble. Harry supposed that was fair. He had blown up a considerable number of cauldrons over the years, and libraries were flammable. Katie spread her books across the table, with the efficiency of someone who'd spent considerable time in study groups, creating neat piles of references and pulling out several different colored quills for what Harry assumed were some kind of organizational system he'd never mastered. Watching her work was oddly fascinating. She approached homework the same way she approached Quidditch, with methodical preparation and quiet determination. "Right," she said, settling into her chair and opening her Ancient Runes textbook. "Let's see what we're dealing with here." The first hour was pure torture. The runic poetry proved to be even more incomprehensible than either of them had feared, full of obscure metaphors and grammatical constructions that seemed to exist solely to confuse students 6 centuries later. Harry found himself staring at the same line of runes for 10 minutes at a time, his eyes crossing as he tried to make sense of symbols that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a grudge against literacy. "This is hopeless," he muttered, dropping his quill and rubbing his eyes. "I'm going to fail Ancient Runes and disappoint McGonagall and probably end up working in a shop somewhere, selling cauldrons to people who actually understand how to use them." "Don't be dramatic," Katie said absently, though Harry noticed she looked nearly as frustrated as he felt. "You're not going to fail. We're just approaching this wrong." "What do you mean?" Katie was quiet for a moment, tapping her quill against her lips in a way that Harry found unaccountably distracting. "Poetry isn't really about literal translation, is it? It's about feeling, about capturing something that can't be said directly. Maybe instead of trying to translate word for word, we should try to understand what the poem is actually about." Harry looked at the incomprehensible symbols again, feeling skeptical. "And how exactly do we do that when half the words aren't even in our dictionary?" "Context clues," Katie said, warming to her idea. "Look at this line here. See how it's got the rune for warrior, and then something that looks like sorrow. And this bit has winter and death. It's probably about a fallen hero, or maybe someone mourning a loss." Harry studied the symbols she was pointing to, and gradually something began to click into place. "You're right. And this section here, it's got ship and sea and something that might be journey. Maybe it's about going to war? Or going home from war," Katie suggested. "Look at the way the verses are structured. It starts with battle imagery, then moves to loss, then ends with the sea journey. It could be about a warrior's funeral, or someone trying to return home after everything's changed." As they worked together, piecing together fragments of meaning from the ancient text, Harry found himself stealing glances at Katie's face. She had a small line of concentration between her eyebrows when she was thinking hard, and a habit of twisting a strand of hair around her finger when she was puzzling through a particularly difficult passage. Her handwriting was neat and precise, nothing like Harry's sprawling scrawl, and she had a way of organizing information that made even the most complex concepts seem manageable. "You're good at this," he said, after they'd successfully translated their first complete stanza. "Good at what?" "Making sense of things. Taking something that seems impossible and breaking it down into pieces that actually make sense." Harry paused, trying to find the right words. "I've never been good at that. I usually just throw myself at problems and hope something works out." Katie looked at him with interest. "Is that what you did with you-know-who? Just threw yourself at the problem?" The question should have made Harry uncomfortable. People usually either avoided mentioning Voldemort entirely or brought him up with the kind of reverent intensity that made Harry want to disappear. But Katie's tone was curious rather than awed, as if she were asking about a particularly challenging transfiguration essay rather than a series of life-or-death encounters with the most feared wizard in Britain. "Pretty much," Harry said, surprised by how easy it was to answer honestly. "Every time I've faced him, it's been because I've stumbled into something, or made a stupid decision, or refused to listen to people who were trying to keep me safe. I've never actually had a plan beyond try not to die." "And yet you're still here," Katie pointed out. "Luck," Harry said automatically. "Just stupid, impossible luck." Katie gave him a look that was both fond and exasperated. "Harry, I've watched you play Quidditch for 6 years. You don't catch the snitch because you're lucky. You catch it because you're stubborn and determined, and you never give up, even when you probably should." Harry felt his cheeks warm. "That's different. Quidditch is just a game." "Is it?" Katie challenged. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you approach everything the same way, with this absolute refusal to quit, even when the odds are against you. That's not luck, Harry. That's character." The word hung in the air between them, and Harry found himself looking down at his hands, overwhelmed by the simple certainty in Katie's voice. He'd spent so many years being told he was special, famous, important, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone recognize something in him that had nothing to do with his scar or his history. "Tell me about your family," he said suddenly, needing to change the subject before he did something embarrassing like tear up again. Katie blinked at the abrupt transition, then settled back in her chair with a small smile. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Harry said, and realized he meant it. "You mentioned your father yesterday, about him being Muggle. What's that like?" Katie's expression softened. "Complicated," she said. "Dad's a civil engineer. He builds bridges and roads and things like that. Very practical, very logical, very much convinced that everything has a rational explanation. When Mum got her Hogwarts letter 25 years ago, he spent 6 months trying to figure out how the magic tricks were done. He thought it was fake? He thought it was the most elaborate practical joke in history," Katie said with a laugh. "Mum had to turn his coffee cup into a mouse before he'd believe her. And even then, he kept looking for hidden wires and secret compartments. It wasn't until I started showing signs of magic that he really accepted it." Harry tried to imagine what that must have been like, having a parent who didn't understand magic, who couldn't share that fundamental part of your identity. Was it hard, growing up between two worlds like that? "Sometimes," Katie admitted. "Dad tries. He really does, but there are things I can't explain to him. Like why I love flying so much, or what it feels like to cast a spell, or why I'd rather spend my summers at magical summer camp than going to the beach like normal families. And Mum sometimes gets frustrated with the Muggle world. She can't understand why Dad won't just use magic to fix things, why he insists on doing everything the hard way. But they love each other," Harry said. It wasn't a question. "They do," Katie said, her voice warm with affection. They love each other enough to make it work, even when they don't understand each other. Dad learned to cook because Mum's idea of preparing dinner is waving her wand at ingredients and hoping something edible appears. Mum learned to use a computer because Dad's work is important to him, and she wanted to understand it. Harry found himself thinking about the Dursleys, about Uncle Vernon's horror at anything even remotely connected to magic, about Aunt Petunia's bitter resentment of the sister who'd been special in ways she could never be. The contrast was stark and painful. "That sounds nice," he said quietly. Katie must have heard something in his voice, because her expression grew gentle. "Your aunt and uncle aren't like that, are they?" "No," Harry said. "They're not." He'd never talked about the Dursleys with anyone other than Ron and Hermione, and even then, he'd always downplayed the worst of it. But something about Katie's quiet attention made the words come easier than they ever had before. "They hate magic," he said simply. "Hate it and fear it, and blame it for everything wrong in their lives. My aunt, my mother's sister, she spent years trying to pretend that magic didn't exist, that her sister was normal, and when she couldn't ignore it anymore, she decided it was something shameful, something to be hidden and suppressed and never talked about." Katie nodded, encouraging him to continue without pushing. "They never told me the truth about how my parents died," Harry continued. "Said they'd been killed in a car crash, that they'd been drunks and layabouts who'd gotten what they deserved. They made me sleep in a cupboard until I was 11 and convinced me that everything strange that happened around me was my fault, that I was a freak who brought nothing but trouble." "Harry," Katie said softly, and there was something in her voice that made his chest tight. "The worst part is," Harry said, the words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them all out before he lost his nerve. "Part of me still believes them sometimes. When things go wrong, when people get hurt because of me, there's this voice in my head that sounds just like my uncle, telling me that I'm the problem, that everyone would be better off if I'd just disappear." Katie was quiet for a long moment, and Harry began to worry that he'd said too much, shared too much darkness. But when he finally looked up at her, her dark eyes were blazing with something that looked very much like anger. "They were wrong," she said firmly. "Your aunt and uncle were wrong about everything. You're not a freak, you're not the problem, and the world is absolutely better with you in it." The simple certainty in her voice nearly undid him. Harry had to look away, focusing on a water ring on the table to keep from doing something embarrassing like crying in the library. "You don't know that," he said weakly. "Yes, I do," Katie said. "I've watched you, Harry. I've seen you throw yourself between other people and danger without a second thought. I've seen you take responsibility for things that weren't your fault and carry guilt that belonged to other people. I've seen you be kinder and braver and more selfless than anyone has a right to expect from a 17-year-old boy who's been through what you've been through." Harry risked a glance at her and found her leaning forward in her chair, her expression intense. "And more than that," she continued, "I've seen you make other people better just by being around them. Ron's braver when he's with you. Hermione's more confident. Neville stands straighter. You bring out the best in people, Harry, and that's not something a freak or a problem person could do." Harry felt something warm unfurl in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "You really believe that?" "I do," Katie said simply, "and I think if you gave me a chance, I could prove it to you." They looked at each other across the table, surrounded by books and parchment and the comfortable silence of the library, and Harry felt something fundamental shift between them. Not the desperate, overwhelming connection he'd felt in the abandoned classroom, but something steadier, quieter, like the beginning of trust. "I'd like that," he said, quietly. Katie's smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Good." Because I was running out of ways to convince you without resorting to interpretive dance. Harry laughed, the sound startling in the quiet of the library. Interpretive dance? I'm very expressive, Katie said solemnly. Ask Alicia. She once made me demonstrate the entire plot of Macbeth through modern dance, because I couldn't remember the character names for our Muggle Studies essay. I would pay good money to see that, Harry said, trying to imagine serious, practical Katie Bell flailing around a dormitory room in the name of Shakespeare. Don't tempt me, Katie warned. I'm still bitter about getting a B on that essay. They returned to their homework after that, but the atmosphere between them had shifted again. The conversation flowed more easily now, punctuated by Katie's quiet observations about runic grammar and Harry's increasingly ridiculous attempts to pronounce Old Norse words. When Katie laughed at his mangled pronunciation of what was apparently a word meaning glorious death in battle, Harry found himself studying her face with new attention. She had a lovely laugh, he realized, rich and full-throated and completely unself-conscious. Her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was really amused, and she had a small dimple in her left cheek that only appeared when she was trying not to laugh at something particularly ridiculous. "You're staring," Katie said, without looking up from her parchment. Harry felt his face go red. "I wasn't—" "You were," Katie said, and now she was looking at him, her eyes dancing with amusement. "It's all right. I'm quite used to being admired for my intellectual prowess." "Is that what I was doing?" Harry asked, surprised by his own boldness. Katie's cheeks flushed pink. Well, I assumed. I mean, what else would you be?" She trailed off, seeming to realize the implications of her own question, and Harry found himself grinning at her obvious discomfort. "Maybe I was just thinking about how much I like your laugh," he said, then immediately wondered where that had come from. Katie's blush deepened. "My laugh? It's very authentic," Harry said, feeling like he was walking into dangerous territory, but unable to stop himself. "Most people at Hogwarts have these careful, practiced laughs that they think make them sound sophisticated. Yours is just real." Katie stared at him for a moment, her lips slightly parted, and Harry had the sudden, terrifying realization that he wanted to kiss her. The thought came out of nowhere, hitting him with the force of a bludger to the chest, and he found himself leaning slightly forward, without conscious decision. "Harry," Katie said softly, and there was something in her voice that made his pulse skip. "Yeah? We should probably finish this homework before Madam Pince throws us out." The practical words broke the spell, and Harry sat back in his chair, feeling slightly dazed. What had just happened? When had Katie Bell, teammate and study partner, become Katie Bell, girl whose laugh made his stomach do interesting things? "Right," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Homework. Very important." "Very important," Katie agreed, though her eyes were still soft with something that hadn't been there an hour ago. They bent over their parchments again, but Harry found himself acutely aware of every small movement Katie made. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the way she bit her lower lip when she was puzzling through a particularly difficult passage, the way her fingers looked holding her quill. When had he started noticing things like that? "I think we've got it," Katie announced finally, holding up her parchment with obvious satisfaction. 3 paragraphs of Old Norse poetry, successfully translated through the power of teamwork and stubborn determination. Harry looked at his own parchment, which was significantly messier than Katie's, but contained roughly the same information. "We actually did it. I can't believe we actually did it." "Told you we made a good team," Katie said, beginning to pack up her books. "Yeah," Harry said, watching her efficient movements with something that felt dangerously close to fondness. "We do." As they walked back to Gryffindor Tower, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, Harry found himself thinking about the afternoon they'd just shared. It had been so normal, so wonderfully ordinary, just 2 students struggling with homework and talking about their families and laughing at each other's terrible pronunciation. But somehow, in the midst of all that normalcy, something had shifted. Some barrier had come down, some door had opened, and Harry wasn't entirely sure he knew how to walk through it. "Harry," Katie said, as they reached the portrait of the fat lady. "Thank you. For today, I mean. For telling me about your family. For letting me help with the homework. For just being normal with me." Harry looked at her, standing in the flickering torchlight with her books clutched against her chest and her hair slightly mussed from their afternoon in the library, and felt that warm unfurling in his chest again. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing me as normal in the first place." Katie smiled, soft and warm and full of possibilities that Harry was only just beginning to understand. "Anytime, Harry Potter. Anytime at all." She disappeared through the portrait hole, leaving Harry alone in the corridor with the scent of her shampoo lingering in the air, and the growing realization that his life had just become significantly more complicated, and for once he found he didn't mind the complications at all. Chapter 4. The Incident. 3 weeks into their unlikely friendship, Harry Potter had developed what he was beginning to suspect was a dangerous habit. He looked for Katie Bell everywhere. Not in an obvious way, of course. He wasn't following her around like some lovesick first year or rearranging his schedule to coincide with hers, but he found himself glancing toward the Gryffindor table at breakfast to see if she was there yet, scanning the corridors between classes in case they happened to cross paths, and feeling an odd little jump of satisfaction when he spotted her dark head bent over a book in the library. It was ridiculous, really. They saw each other almost every day now. Study sessions had become routine. Casual conversations in the common room were commonplace, and they'd even started walking to classes together when their schedules aligned. Harry had more access to Katie Bell now than he'd had in 6 years of knowing her. There was no logical reason for him to keep seeking her out with his eyes like some kind of human tracking charm. And yet... "You're doing it again," Hermione said, without looking up from her arithmancy homework. Harry blinked, focusing on his best friend's knowing expression. They were sitting in the common room on a Saturday afternoon, supposedly working on their respective assignments, though Harry had to admit he'd spent more time watching the portrait hole than he had on his defense essay. "Doing what?" he asked, attempting innocence. "Looking for Katie," Ron said from his position, sprawled on the carpet, where he was making a valiant attempt to understand the finer points of transfiguration theory. "You've been staring at that door for the past 10 minutes. Harry felt his cheeks warm. "I was thinking." "About Katie," Hermione said, and now she was looking at him with that particular expression that meant she was about to say something he didn't want to hear. "Harry, you know we like Katie. She's lovely, and she's clearly been good for you. But are you sure you know what you're doing?" "What do you mean?" Hermione set down her quill and gave him her full attention, which was never a comfortable experience when she was in serious mode. "I mean that 3 weeks ago, you barely knew Katie Bell existed beyond her role as a chaser. Now you're practically joined at the hip, and you get this look on your face every time someone mentions her name." "What look?" Harry demanded, though he suspected he didn't want to know. "Like she's the most fascinating person you've ever met," Ron said helpfully. "Which, no offense, mate, but it's a bit intense." Harry opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again as he realized he couldn't. Because the truth was, Katie had become the most fascinating person he'd ever met. Not because she was particularly exotic or mysterious. Quite the opposite, actually. Katie was refreshingly straightforward, practical in a way that cut through Harry's tendency toward dramatic overthinking, funny without trying too hard to be clever. She made everything seem more manageable somehow, as if her mere presence was proof that the world contained more than just darkness and prophecy and the weight of everyone's expectations. "It's not like that," he said weakly. "Isn't it?" Hermione asked gently. "Harry, I've watched you with Cho. and I watched you realize you fancied Ginny. This is different. More intense." Before Harry could formulate a response to that terrifying observation, the portrait hole swung open, and Katie herself appeared, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and her scarf wound high around her neck. She was carrying several packages from Hogsmeade, and her hair was slightly windblown in a way that made Harry's stomach do something complicated. "Oh, hello," she said, spotting their little group by the fireplace. "How's the studying going?" "Brilliantly," Ron said with obvious sarcasm, gesturing at his barely started essay. "I'm discovering new and creative ways to fail transfiguration." Katie laughed, setting her packages down on a nearby table. "Want some help? I actually managed to get an outstanding on McGonagall's last assignment, which I'm pretty sure makes me qualified to tutor at least one subject." "Would you?" Ron asked hopefully. "Because I'm fairly certain I'm about to turn my quill into a live ferret, and that seems like it might be frowned upon." "I'd be happy to help," Katie said, then glanced at Harry. "That is, if you don't mind me stealing your study partner." The casual assumption that Harry would mind, that his time with Katie was precious enough to be protective of, sent a warm flutter through his chest that he chose not to examine too closely. "Go ahead," he said. "I should probably actually work on this defense essay anyway." Katie settled onto the carpet next to Ron, pulling out her own transfiguration notes, and Harry found himself watching the easy way she interacted with his best friend. She was patient with Ron's questions, encouraging without being patronizing, and when she laughed at one of his self-deprecating jokes, Harry felt an odd stab of something that might have been jealousy, which was completely irrational. Ron was his best mate, and he was practically a brother to Ginny, and there was absolutely nothing threatening about him helping with homework. The fact that Harry's jaw was clenched as he watched Katie explain the principles of cross-species transfiguration was just stress from his defense essay, which was going very poorly now that he thought about it. "Harry," Hermione said quietly, and when he looked at her, her expression was knowing and slightly sympathetic. "Maybe you should talk to her." "Talk to her about what?" "About whatever it is that's making you look like you want to hex Ron for accepting tutoring help." Harry felt his face go red. "I don't want to hex Ron." "No," Hermione raised an eyebrow, "because you've been gripping your quill hard enough to snap it for the past 5 minutes. Harry looked down and discovered that she was right. The quill in his hand was bent nearly in half, and his knuckles were white from the force of his grip. He set it down carefully and tried to pretend this was normal behavior. "I'm fine," he said. "Of course you are," Hermione said dryly. "And I'm the Queen of England." Before Harry could respond to that, Katie was gathering her things and standing up, having apparently finished helping Ron with his essay. She glanced over at Harry with a smile that made his chest feel tight. "I'm going to head up to the dormitory," she said. "Early morning tomorrow. McGonagall wants to see me about something before classes start." "Everything all right?" Harry asked, surprised by the concern in his own voice. "Oh, I'm sure it's fine," Katie said, though there was something slightly uncertain in her expression. "Probably just wants to discuss my new tea preparation, or something equally thrilling." She said goodbye to Ron and Hermione, then paused by Harry's chair. For a moment, he thought she might say something more, might linger the way she sometimes did when they were alone. Instead, she just touched his shoulder briefly, a casual gesture that somehow felt more intimate than it should have. "See you tomorrow, Harry." "Yeah," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "See you tomorrow." She disappeared up the stairs to the girls' dormitories, and Harry was left staring after her with the unsettling realization that he already missed her, even though she'd only been gone for 30 seconds. "Merlin's beard," Ron said, looking between Harry and the empty staircase. "You've got it bad, haven't you?" Harry didn't bother denying it this time. The next morning dawned grey and blustery, with the kind of wind that rattled the windows and made everyone grateful to be inside. Harry woke earlier than usual, restless with a vague sense of unease that he couldn't quite identify. He'd dreamed of green light and cold laughter, the same nightmares that had plagued him for years. But there had been something different this time. Something about Katie, though the details slipped away like smoke the moment he tried to grasp them. He made his way down to the great hall for breakfast, hoping that food and Katie's presence would chase away the lingering shadows of his dreams. But when he reached the Gryffindor table, her usual spot was empty. "She's not here yet," Hermione said, noticing his searching glance. "I saw her leave early this morning. She mentioned something about meeting McGonagall before classes." Harry nodded, trying to ignore the way his stomach twisted with disappointment. It was ridiculous to be this affected by Katie's absence from one meal. They weren't joined at the hip, despite what Ron and Hermione seemed to think. Katie had her own life, her own responsibilities, her own relationships that had nothing to do with him. But as the morning wore on and there was still no sign of her, Harry found his unease growing into something approaching anxiety. She hadn't appeared for potions, where she usually sat 2 rows behind him, and occasionally caught his eye to roll hers at Slughorn's increasingly ridiculous anecdotes. She wasn't in the library during the break between morning and afternoon classes, where they'd taken to spending their free periods working on homework together. By the time Defense Against the Dark Arts rolled around, Harry was actively scanning the corridors for any sign of Katie's familiar figure. It wasn't like her to simply disappear without a word, especially not when they'd made loose plans to work on ancient runes together after dinner. "She's probably still with McGonagall," Hermione said, as they took their seats in the defense classroom. "You know how these career consultations can run long." Harry nodded, but the explanation felt wrong somehow. McGonagall was efficient with her time, and Katie was nothing if not punctual. She wouldn't simply miss classes without sending word, especially not when she was so focused on her new tea preparations. The feeling of wrongness only intensified as the afternoon progressed. By dinner time, when Katie still hadn't appeared, Harry was struggling to concentrate on anything other than the growing certainty that something was seriously amiss. "Maybe you should ask McGonagall," Ron suggested, as they sat down to dinner. "If Katie was supposed to meet with her this morning, she'd know where she's gone." It was a reasonable suggestion, but before Harry could act on it, Professor McGonagall herself appeared at the staff table, looking more severe than usual. She caught Harry's eye across the great hall and gave him a small nod, not reassuring exactly, but acknowledging, as if she knew he was looking for Katie and wanted him to know that she was aware of the situation. Harry was halfway through his shepherd's pie when the doors to the great hall burst open and Hagrid strode in, his massive frame filling the doorway. But it wasn't his size that made conversation falter throughout the hall. It was his expression. Hagrid looked shaken, more upset than Harry had seen him since Buckbeak's near execution. "Professor McGonagall," Hagrid called, his booming voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet hall. "Professor Dumbledore, need to speak with you. It's urgent." McGonagall and Dumbledore rose from their seats immediately, their expressions grave. As they moved toward Hagrid, Harry caught fragments of his whispered explanation. "Found her near the 3 broomsticks. Cursed object. St. Mungo's." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. Found her. Cursed object. There was only one person who could be talking about. Only one reason Hagrid would look so devastated, and McGonagall would be nodding with that particular expression of controlled concern. Katie. Harry was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move, his chair scraping against the stone floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. Around him, other conversations were resuming as students returned to their dinners, unaware that Harry's world had just tilted on its axis. "Harry," Hermione said, reaching for his arm. "Harry, wait!" But Harry was already moving, pushing through the tables toward where Hagrid was still talking to the professors. He needed to know what had happened, needed to know if Katie was all right, needed to do something other than stand there, while the girl who had become the most important person in his life was apparently lying in St. Mungo's. "Cursed necklace," Hagrid was saying as Harry approached. "Right nasty piece of work. Poor girl was screaming something awful before Professor Snape got the curse contained. Screaming. Katie had been screaming, and Harry hadn't been there, hadn't been able to help, hadn't been able to protect her, hadn't even known she was in danger until it was too late. "Is she—" Harry started, but Dumbledore cut him off with a gentle but firm gesture. "Miss Bell is alive, Harry," the headmaster said quietly. "She's been taken to St. Mungo's, where she'll receive the best possible care." Alive. The word should have been comforting, but there was something in Dumbledore's tone that suggested Katie's condition was more serious than he was letting on. "What happened?" Harry demanded, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "How did she get cursed? Where?" "That's enough questions for now, Mr. Potter," McGonagall said crisply, though her expression was not unkind. "Miss Bell's condition is serious but stable. She's in excellent hands at St. Mungo's, and speculating about the circumstances won't help anyone." "But someone did this to her," Harry said, feeling a cold rage building in his chest. "Someone deliberately cursed Katie, and we're just going to stand here and—" "We are going to let the proper authorities handle the investigation," McGonagall said firmly. "You are going to return to your dinner and trust that the adults will take care of this matter appropriately." Harry wanted to argue, wanted to demand more information, wanted to do something, anything, that might help. But the expression on McGonagall's face brooked no argument, and Dumbledore's gentle but immovable presence made it clear that this conversation was over. "Harry." Dumbledore's voice was soft, but it carried easily over the noise of the great hall. "Miss Bell would not want you to blame yourself for this. These things happen, and they are not always preventable." The words were clearly meant to be comforting, but they had the opposite effect. How had Dumbledore known that Harry's first instinct was self-recrimination? How had he seen so clearly into Harry's mind, to the growing certainty that if he'd been there, if he'd insisted on going to Hogsmeade with Katie, if he'd been a better friend or a more attentive companion, this might never have happened? Harry nodded stiffly and returned to his table, where Ron and Hermione were waiting, with expressions of concern and sympathy that made his chest feel tight. He sat down heavily, staring at his half-finished dinner and feeling as though the food might as well have been sawdust. "She'll be all right," Hermione said quietly, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "St. Mungo's has the best healers in Britain. If anyone can help her, they can." Harry nodded again, not trusting his voice. The rational part of his mind knew that Hermione was right, that Katie was receiving excellent care, and that there was nothing he could do to help by sitting here and worrying. But the rest of him, the part that had been growing more and more attached to Katie Bell over the past 3 weeks, was screaming that he should be doing something. Anything. "Do we know who did it?" Ron asked quietly. Harry's head snapped up. "What?" "Well, someone had to have cursed the necklace, didn't they? Things like that don't just happen on their own." The thought hadn't fully formed in Harry's mind until Ron voiced it, but now it crystallized with perfect, awful clarity. Someone had deliberately cursed Katie. Someone had wanted to hurt her, or more likely, someone had been trying to hurt someone else, and Katie had gotten caught in the crossfire. "Malfoy," Harry said, the name coming out as barely more than a growl. "Harry," Hermione said, warningly. "You don't know." "It was Malfoy," Harry repeated, more certain with each word. "He's been up to something all year, sneaking around, looking pleased with himself. And now Katie gets cursed by some dark object that just happened to find its way into Hogsmeade? That's not a coincidence." "You can't just accuse someone of attempted murder without proof," Hermione said, though she looked troubled. "Even if Malfoy has been acting strangely." "He tried to kill Katie," Harry said, pushing back from the table. The rage that had been building in his chest was threatening to spill over, and he found himself actually considering the various ways he might make Draco Malfoy pay for what he'd done. "Harry, stop!" Hermione's voice was sharp now, cutting through his rising fury. "Listen to yourself. This is exactly the kind of thinking that led to Sirius—" She cut herself off, but the damage was done. Harry felt the blood drain from his face as the parallel hit home. Once again, he was ready to rush headlong into danger, based on assumptions and emotion rather than facts. Once again, someone he cared about was in danger, and his first instinct was revenge rather than reason. But this was different, wasn't it? Katie wasn't mixed up in some complex plot involving the Department of Mysteries and Death Eater infiltration. She was just a 17-year-old girl who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now she was lying in St. Mungo's because some bastard had decided to use dark magic in a public place. "I need to see her," Harry said quietly. "Harry, you can't just leave school," Ron said. "They're not going to let you waltz into St. Mungo's." "I need to see her," Harry repeated, and there was something in his voice that made both his friends fall silent. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of frustration and barely contained panic. Harry went through the motions of attending his remaining classes, completing his homework, participating in normal conversation, but inside he felt like he was screaming. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined Katie in pain, alone and frightened in a hospital bed, wondering why no one had come to see her. It wasn't until he was lying in his bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to Ron's soft snores, that the full weight of his reaction hit him. 3 weeks ago, Katie Bell had been just another teammate, someone he worked with and occasionally talked to but barely knew as a person. Now the thought of her being hurt, of someone deliberately causing her pain, filled him with a rage so pure and cold that it frightened him. When had she become so important? When had her welfare become something that could send him spiraling into fury and desperation? When had Katie Bell become someone he couldn't bear to lose? The answer, when it came, was both obvious and terrifying. Somewhere between that first conversation in the abandoned classroom and yesterday's casual touch on his shoulder, Harry had fallen for Katie Bell. Not the desperate, aching infatuation he'd felt for Cho, not the confused tangle of guilt and affection that characterized his feelings for Ginny, but something deeper, something that felt less like falling and more like coming home. And now she was hurt, and he couldn't even see her. Harry must have dozed eventually, because he woke to someone shaking his shoulder. He blinked up to find Dean Thomas standing beside his bed, fully dressed despite the early hour. "Harry," Dean said quietly, "you need to come with me. Professor McGonagall wants to see you." Harry was instantly alert, his heart jumping into his throat. "Is it Katie? Is she?" "I don't know," Dean said honestly. "She just said to bring you to her office. But Harry, you should probably get dressed quickly." Harry threw on his robes with shaking hands, his mind racing through all the possible reasons McGonagall might summon him at what couldn't be much past dawn. None of the scenarios he could imagine were good ones. McGonagall's office was warm and softly lit, a stark contrast to the grey morning outside. The professor herself was sitting behind her desk with a cup of tea that suggested she'd been awake for some time, and her expression was carefully neutral in a way that made Harry's stomach clench. "Sit down, Potter," she said gently. Harry sat, his hands clenched in his lap. "Is Katie all right? Is she—" "Miss Bell is stable," McGonagall said, which wasn't exactly the reassurance Harry had been hoping for. "The curse has been contained, and she's no longer in immediate danger." "But—" McGonagall sighed, and for a moment she looked every one of her many years. "But the damage was extensive. She'll need to remain at St. Mungo's for some time, while they work, to fully remove the curse's effects." "How long?" Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Several months at minimum, possibly longer, depending on how she responds to treatment." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. Months. Katie would be gone for months, lying in a hospital bed while he sat here at Hogwarts, unable to help, unable to see her, unable to do anything but wait and worry. "There is, however, something you can do," McGonagall continued, as if she'd read his thoughts. Harry looked up sharply. "What?" "Miss Bell has been asking for you. Specifically, The healers at St. Mungo's have indicated that she's been quite distressed about not being able to say goodbye properly, and they believe that seeing a familiar face might aid in her recovery. Hope flared in Harry's chest, bright and desperate. "You'll let me visit her?" "I'll arrange for you to flew to St. Mungo's this afternoon, after classes," McGonagall said. "You'll have 1 hour with Miss Bell, under the supervision of her healers. I trust I don't need to explain how irregular this is, or how important it is that you follow all hospital protocols." "Of course," Harry said quickly. "Whatever they need. I need to see her. I need to know she's all right." McGonagall studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Potter, I hope you understand that Miss Bell's injury, while serious, is not your fault. You could not have prevented this, and blaming yourself will help no one." The words were almost identical to what Dumbledore had said the night before, and they had just as little effect now as they had then. Harry nodded anyway, knowing that protesting would only delay his visit to Katie. "The flu network will be available at 4 o'clock, McGonagall continued. "Don't be late." Harry spent the rest of the day in a state of barely controlled anticipation, going through the motions of attending classes, while his mind remained firmly fixed on 4 o'clock and St. Mungo's, and the chance to finally see Katie with his own eyes. He barely heard Professor Slughorn's lecture on advanced potion-making, completely failed to follow the complexities of ancient runic grammar, and nearly singed off his eyebrows in charms when his concentration slipped at a crucial moment. By the time 4 o'clock arrived, Harry felt like he'd been wound so tight that he might snap at any moment. He presented himself at McGonagall's office with minutes to spare, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Remember," McGonagall said, as she handed him a pinch of flu powder, 1 hour. Follow all hospital protocols. And Potter, try not to upset Miss Bell with any dramatic declarations or emotional outbursts. She needs rest, not additional stress." Harry nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he could promise emotional stability where Katie was concerned. He stepped into the fireplace, threw down the flu powder, and spoke the words that would take him to her. "St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries." The world dissolved into green flames and spinning motion, and then Harry was stumbling out of a fireplace into a sterile white reception area that smelled of disinfectant and healing potions. A stern-looking witch in lime-green robes was waiting for him. "Mr. Potter, I presume. I'm Healer Whitman. If you'll follow me, please." She led him through a maze of corridors that all looked identical, past rooms filled with the quietly suffering and the quietly healing. Harry tried not to look too closely at the other patients, but he couldn't help noticing the variety of magical ailments on display. A man whose fingers appeared to be growing into tree branches, a woman whose hair was literally on fire but didn't seem to be causing her pain, a child who kept flickering in and out of visibility. "Miss Bell is in our long-term care ward," Healer Whitman explained as they walked. The curse she encountered was particularly nasty, a combination of dark magic and ancient protective enchantments that created a feedback loop. We've managed to stabilize her condition, but removing the curse entirely will take time. "Is she in pain?" Harry asked, surprised by how difficult it was to get the words out. "Some discomfort, but nothing we can't manage with the proper potions. The greater concern is the psychological impact. Miss Bell has been quite distressed since the incident, and we believe that seeing familiar faces will help with her recovery." They stopped in front of a door marked "Private Ward, Authorized Personnel Only." Healer Whitman produced a complex-looking key from her robes and unlocked it with a series of intricate wand movements. 1 hour, Mr. Potter. Please try to keep the conversation light. Nothing too emotionally taxing. If Miss Bell becomes distressed, you'll need to leave immediately." Harry nodded, his throat suddenly too tight for words. Healer Whitman opened the door and gestured him inside. The room was small but comfortable, with a large window that looked out over London, and a single bed surrounded by the kind of magical monitoring equipment that Harry associated with serious medical situations. And in that bed, looking smaller and more fragile than Harry had ever seen her, was Katie. She was awake, propped up against several pillows, and her face lit up when she saw him in a way that made Harry's chest feel like it might explode. "Harry," she said, and her voice was hoarse but warm with genuine pleasure. "You came." "Of course I came," Harry said, moving to the chair beside her bed. "How could I not?" Katie smiled, and despite the pallor of her skin and the dark circles under her eyes, she was still the most beautiful thing Harry had ever seen. "I was worried you'd blame yourself," she said quietly. "I know how your mind works." The fact that she knew him well enough to predict his emotional responses, even while lying in a hospital bed recovering from a curse, did something complicated to Harry's heart. "I don't blame myself," he lied. Katie gave him a look that suggested she saw right through him. "Liar." "All right. Maybe I blame myself a little," Harry admitted. "If I'd been with you in Hogsmeade, if I'd insisted on going—" "Then you might have been cursed too," Katie interrupted firmly, "and I would never forgive myself for that." They looked at each other for a moment, and Harry felt the same electric connection he'd experienced in the library weeks ago, amplified by relief and fear and the terrible awareness of how close he'd come to losing her. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Katie sighed, settling back against her pillows. "I wish I could tell you. I remember going to Hogsmeade, doing some shopping, having a butterbeer at the Three Broomsticks. Then I was walking back toward the castle and—" She frowned, her brow creasing with concentration. "Someone approached me. A woman, I think, though I can't remember her face. She had something, a package, or maybe a bag. She said something about it being a gift, or maybe she asked me to deliver it somewhere. You don't remember clearly? The healers say that's normal with curse damage this severe. The mind protects itself by blurring traumatic memories." Katie touched her throat gingerly. "The next thing I remember is pain. Terrible, burning pain, like my skin was on fire from the inside. And then nothing until I woke up here." Harry felt that cold rage building in his chest again. Someone had deliberately targeted Katie, had used her natural kindness and helpfulness to trick her into touching a cursed object. The premeditation of it, the calculated cruelty, made him want to find whoever was responsible and make them pay in the most painful way possible. "Harry," Katie's voice was gentle but firm. "I can see you working yourself up. Don't." "Someone tried to kill you," Harry said through clenched teeth. "They used dark magic on you, and you nearly died, and I'm supposed to just accept that?" "You're supposed to trust that the proper authorities will handle it," Katie said, echoing McGonagall's words from the night before. "You're supposed to visit me and tell me about school and help me not go completely mad with boredom, not sit there plotting revenge." "I'm not plotting revenge," Harry protested. "Aren't you?" Harry opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again as he realized she was right. He had been plotting revenge, planning ways to make whoever had hurt Katie suffer the way she had suffered. The recognition should have been disturbing, but instead it felt oddly natural. Of course he wanted to hurt the person who'd hurt Katie. Of course he wanted to make them pay. "Maybe a little," he admitted. Katie laughed, a sound that was weak but genuine, and Harry felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "That's what I thought," she said fondly. "You have a very distinctive brooding expression, all narrowed eyes and clenched jaw." "I don't brood," Harry said automatically. "Of course not. You contemplate meaningfully." Katie shifted slightly in her bed, wincing as the movement pulled at something painful. "Tell me about school. Are you keeping up with ancient runes without me?" The casual way she asked, as if their study sessions were the most important thing in the world, made Harry's throat tight. "Barely," he said. "Turns out I actually need you to make sense of that runic poetry." "I'm flattered by your dependence on my intellectual prowess," Katie said lightly. "What about Quidditch? Have you started recruiting my replacement yet? The question hit Harry like a physical blow. In all his worry about Katie's condition, he hadn't even considered the practical implications of her absence. She was right. They would need to find another chaser, would need to restructure the entire team around her absence. The thought of someone else taking her position, of playing Quidditch without Katie Bell on his team, was almost unbearable. I haven't thought about it, he said honestly. Well, you should. The team needs to keep practicing, and you can't wait months for me to recover. Katie's voice was matter-of-fact, but Harry thought he detected a note of sadness underneath. Demelza Robbins would be good, I think. She's got the natural ability, and she's been coming to all the practices even though she's not officially on the team. Katie, Harry said quietly, I don't want to replace you. Something shifted in Katie's expression, a softness that made Harry's pulse skip. You're not replacing me, Harry. You're keeping the team going until I can come back. Will you? Harry asked, the question coming out more vulnerable than he'd intended. Come back, I mean. Of course I will, Katie said firmly. It's going to take more than a cursed necklace to keep me away from Hogwarts. Besides, she added with a small smile, someone needs to help you with your ancient runes homework. They talked for the rest of the hour about inconsequential things. Harry's classes, the latest gossip from Gryffindor Tower, Katie's boredom with hospital food and institutional routine. It was easy, comfortable conversation that felt achingly normal despite the sterile hospital setting. But underneath the casual chatter, Harry was acutely aware of the deeper currents running between them, the unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted in their relationship. He'd been prepared for many things when he'd agreed to visit Katie. Tears, anger, fear, despair. What he hadn't been prepared for was the quiet contentment that settled over him as he sat beside her bed, listening to her voice and watching the way her eyes lit up when she laughed. Even here, even under these circumstances, being with Katie felt like the most natural thing in the world. When Healer Whitman appeared in the doorway to signal that his time was up, Harry felt a stab of loss so sharp it took his breath away. I have to go, he said quietly. I know, Katie replied, and her voice was soft with understanding. But you'll come back? As often as they'll let me, Harry promised. Katie smiled, and the warmth in her expression made Harry feel like he could take on the world. Good, she said, because I'll miss you. The words were simple, casual even, but they hit Harry with the force of a revelation. She would miss him. Not just his help with homework or his company during study sessions, but him. Harry Potter, separate from his fame or his role in her life, was someone Katie Bell would miss. I'll miss you too, he said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. Healer Whitman cleared her throat pointedly, and Harry reluctantly stood to leave. As he reached the door, Katie called his name softly. Harry? He turned back to find her looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Thank you, she said, for coming, for caring, for being exactly the friend I needed you to be. Friend. The word should have been comforting, but instead it felt like a door closing on possibilities Harry hadn't even realized he'd been considering. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and followed Healer Whitman out of the room. The flu trip back to Hogwarts passed in a blur of green flames and spinning thoughts. By the time Harry stumbled out of McGonagall's fireplace, he felt like his entire worldview had been reorganized around a single, terrifying truth. Somewhere in the space of an hour, sitting beside Katie Bell's hospital bed, Harry had realized that he was falling in love with her. And she thought of him as a friend. Chapter 5. Absence and Letters. Harry had never been much of a letter writer. This wasn't for lack of correspondence. Over the years he'd exchanged plenty of hastily scrawled notes with Ron and Hermione during holidays, formal thank-you letters to Mrs. Weasley for various jumpers and food parcels, and the occasional terse message to Sirius during his darker periods of self-imposed isolation. But those had all been functional communications, brief updates, or requests for information that served specific purposes and required minimal emotional investment. Writing to Katie, Harry discovered, was an entirely different beast. He'd been staring at the blank piece of parchment on his desk for the better part of an hour, his quill poised uselessly above the page while his dormmates got ready for bed around him. Ron had already given up trying to make conversation and had drawn his bed curtains with the resigned air of someone who recognized obsessive behavior when he saw it. Dean and Seamus were engaged in some complicated negotiation involving chocolate frog cards that Harry was only dimly aware of. Neville was reading what appeared to be a very thick book about carnivorous plants, occasionally making small noises of either delight or horror. All perfectly normal dormitory activity that felt completely surreal when Harry's entire world had narrowed down to 12 inches of parchment and the impossible task of finding words that might bridge the distance between Hogwarts and St. Mungo's. The problem, Harry realized, was that he had no idea what tone to strike. Too casual, and he risked seeming like he didn't care about Katie's condition. Too formal, and he'd sound like he was writing to a distant acquaintance rather than someone who'd become one of the most important people in his life. Too emotional, and he might reveal feelings that Katie had given no indication of returning, feelings that he was still struggling to understand himself. How did you write to someone you were falling in love with when you weren't even sure they knew you existed as anything more than a friend? Harry set down his quill and rubbed his eyes, feeling the familiar pressure building behind his temples that usually accompanied his more spectacular bouts of overthinking. Maybe he was making this more complicated than it needed to be. Katie was in the hospital, probably bored out of her mind and desperate for news from the outside world. She didn't need profound declarations or carefully crafted prose. She needed a friend to remind her that she wasn't forgotten. With that thought to ground him, Harry picked up his quill again and began to write. Dear Katie, I hope you're feeling better than when I saw you last week. The healers seem to know what they're doing, though I have to admit I don't understand half of what they were talking about when I asked about your treatment. Something about curse matrices and magical resonance patterns that sounded impressive, but went completely over my head. Things at Hogwarts are much the same as always. Professor Slughorn is still telling the same stories about his famous friends. Snape's replacement in defense is still completely useless, and McGonagall gave Malfoy detention for hexing a first year's shoes to the floor. The first year was fine, by the way, though he did have to be carried to the hospital wing, still attached to his footwear. I've been keeping up with ancient runes, mostly. Professor Babbling assigned another translation exercise, something about a runic calendar system that's supposed to predict optimal planting seasons. I think I've got the basic structure worked out, but there's this section about moon phases that's making me want to set fire to my textbook. I keep thinking about how you'd approach it, breaking it down into smaller pieces until it makes sense. You always made everything seem manageable somehow. Ron and Hermione send their regards. Well, Hermione actually wrote out a proper message for me to include, but it was 3 pages long and mostly consisted of detailed theories about curse removal techniques, so I thought you might prefer the abbreviated version. Ron's contribution was, "Tell Katie I said hello, and that Quidditch isn't the same without her," which I think covers the essential points. Speaking of Quidditch, I've been thinking about what you said about finding a replacement chaser. You were right about Demelza Robbins. She's got natural talent, and she's been coming to practices even though she's not officially on the team yet. But I want you to know that nobody could actually replace you. We're just keeping your spot warm until you can come back and show us all how it's really done. I miss our study sessions. The library feels wrong without you there, making sense of impossible homework and laughing at my terrible pronunciation of ancient languages. I miss having someone to talk to who doesn't look at me like I'm either a hero or a tragedy waiting to happen. I miss the way you see straight through all the nonsense and get right to the heart of things. I miss you, Katie, more than I probably should. Get well soon. Harry read through the letter twice, his stomach churning with second thoughts. The ending was too much, too revealing, too honest about feelings he wasn't sure he was ready to acknowledge even to himself. But every time he considered rewriting it, something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of Katie's pale face against the hospital pillows, or the way she'd thanked him for being exactly the friend she needed. Maybe it was the growing certainty that life was too short and too dangerous to waste time hiding from the truth. Before he could lose his nerve, Harry folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and wrote Katie's name on the outside in his careful handwriting. He'd send it with the morning post, and hope that honesty was better than artifice. The response came 3 days later, delivered by a sleek brown owl that Harry didn't recognize. He was eating breakfast when the bird landed beside his plate, extending its leg with the kind of dignified patience that suggested it was accustomed to carrying important correspondence. Harry's heart jumped as he recognized his own handwriting on the letter the owl carried. It was his original message, returned with additional writing in Katie's neat script, covering every available margin. Harry, thank you for your letter. I can't tell you how good it felt to hear news from Hogwarts, to have something to think about, other than healing schedules and the various indignities of hospital gowns. Your description of Malfoy's detention made me laugh out loud, which earned me several concerned looks from my healers. Apparently, they weren't expecting me to show signs of amusement quite so soon. I told them I had excellent friends who were committed to maintaining my spirits through the power of gossip, and they seemed to find this medically sound. I'm glad you're keeping up with ancient runes, even if moon phase calculations are driving you to thoughts of arson. Here's a tip. Don't think of the lunar symbols as representing actual astronomical positions. Think of them as metaphors for seasonal change. The ancient Norse weren't concerned with scientific accuracy. They were trying to capture the feeling of time passing, the sense of cycles within cycles. Once you stop trying to make it literal, the meaning becomes clearer. Thank you for what you said about Quidditch. I know the team needs to keep functioning, and Demelza really is talented. But it means more than I can say, to know that you don't see me as easily replaceable. I've been lying here thinking about all the things I should have said and done differently, all the matches I should have played better, all the opportunities I wasted. It's easy to convince yourself that you don't matter much in the grand scheme of things. Your letter reminded me that maybe I do matter, at least to some people. You said you miss having someone to talk to who doesn't see you as a hero or a tragedy. I want you to know that I've never seen you that way. Not when you were 11 years old and famous for something you couldn't even remember. Not when you came back from the graveyard with stories of you-know-who's return that nobody wanted to believe. Not when you were crying in that dusty classroom after the Quidditch match. I've always just seen you as Harry. Stubborn, brave, occasionally infuriating Harry who makes everything more complicated than it needs to be, and somehow always manages to do the right thing anyway. I miss our study sessions too. I miss the way you attack impossible homework, like it's personally offended you. The way you get that little crease between your eyebrows when you're concentrating really hard. The way you look genuinely surprised every time you figure something out, as if intelligence is still something new and unexpected. I miss you too, Harry, more than I expected to. The healers say I might be able to return to Hogwarts before the end of term, though I'll probably miss most of the spring semester. It's frustrating to be away for so long, but there's something oddly peaceful about being removed from everything for a while. It gives you perspective on what actually matters. Write to me again soon. Hospital food is terrible, and the entertainment options are limited, but your letters make everything bearable. Katie P.S. I've enclosed a book on advanced runic translation that one of the healers lent me. Chapter 7 has a section on lunar symbolism that might help with Professor Babbling's latest torture assignment. Harry read Katie's letter 4 times before breakfast was over, absorbing every line and margin note with the kind of attention he usually reserved for complicated spell work. Her handwriting was smaller than usual, cramped by the need to fit so much onto the limited space of his original parchment. But her voice came through clearly, warm, intelligent, gently teasing in a way that made his chest feel tight with affection. More than I expected to. The words circled in Harry's mind as he made his way to potions, carrying Katie's letter folded carefully in his robe's pocket. She missed him more than she'd expected to. What did that mean? Was it just friendly affection? Or something deeper? And why did the question feel so important when Katie was lying in a hospital bed recovering from a cursed necklace attack? "You're doing it again," Hermione said, as they settled into their seats in the potions dungeon. "Doing what?" "That thing where you stare into the middle distance with a slightly glazed expression. You've been doing it ever since that owl arrived at breakfast." Hermione studied his face with the kind of analytical attention that always made Harry feel like a particularly interesting specimen. "That was from Katie, wasn't it?" Harry nodded, not trusting his voice to remain casual. "And she wrote something that's got you all wound up in knots," Hermione continued. "Want to talk about it?" "There's nothing to talk about," Harry said automatically, then caught Hermione's skeptical expression. "All right, maybe there's something to talk about, but I don't know what it is yet." "Harry," Hermione said gently, "you know it's all right to have feelings for Katie, don't you? I mean, as long as you're not just confusing gratitude and relief with something deeper." The suggestion that his feelings might be confused or artificial should have been insulting, but instead it struck Harry as oddly comforting. It would be easier, certainly, if what he felt for Katie was just a temporary emotional response to her injury. Easier to manage, easier to understand, easier to ignore, until it faded into something more manageable. But even as the thought formed, Harry knew it wasn't true. His feelings for Katie had been growing long before the cursed necklace incident, building slowly through weeks of study sessions and conversations and shared laughter. The attack had simply forced him to acknowledge what had already been there, waiting for him to be brave enough to see it. "It's not gratitude," he said quietly. "Then what is it?" Harry was quiet for a long moment, watching Professor Slughorn arrange ingredients for the day's lesson with his usual theatrical flair. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I know I want to find out." The second letter came a week later, this time on proper stationery that suggested Katie had prevailed upon someone to provide her with writing materials more substantial than Harry's returned parchment. Her handwriting was stronger this time, more like her usual confident script, though Harry thought he could detect traces of the effort it still cost her to write for extended periods. "Dear Harry, your latest letter was exactly what I needed after a particularly trying day of gentle exercise and therapeutic consultation. I've decided that healers have a gift for making the most reasonable activities sound either patronizing or vaguely sinister. Yesterday's guided mobility work turned out to be a 20-minute walk around the ward, and emotional processing therapy was an hour of discussing my feelings about the attack with a very earnest witch who kept nodding and saying, "I see," in response to everything I told her. I did learn something interesting during one of these sessions, though. The healer mentioned that cursed objects like the necklace that affected me are often used as weapons of opportunity rather than targeted attacks. Apparently, whoever enchanted it was likely trying to hurt someone else, possibly someone with regular access to Hogsmeade, someone important enough to be worth the risk of using illegal dark magic. I keep thinking about this, about how the woman who approached me seemed confused, as if she'd expected someone else, about how she kept insisting the package was meant for a specific person, though I can't remember who. The healers say memory gaps are normal with curse damage, but it's frustrating to know that I'm missing something important. I'm probably overthinking it. The important thing is that I'm getting better, not solving mysteries from my hospital bed. But I can't shake the feeling that this wasn't random, that someone at Hogwarts was supposed to receive that necklace, and I just happened to get in the way. I hope you'll be careful, Harry. I know you have a tendency to throw yourself into danger without thinking about the consequences, and I worry that whoever is behind this might try again with a different target. Promise me you won't do anything stupidly heroic while I'm stuck here and can't talk sense into you. On a lighter note, how are your ancient runes coming along? Did the book I sent help with the lunar symbolism? I've been working through some translation exercises to keep my mind sharp, and I found a particularly ridiculous example of runic love poetry that made me think of your struggles with archaic grammar. The poet is trying to convince his beloved that she's more beautiful than the northern lights, but he's used a conjugation pattern that actually compares her to a particularly stubborn type of root vegetable. I'm not sure if it's terrible translation or the worst pickup line in history. I miss our study sessions too, but I've been thinking about our conversation in the library that first afternoon we worked together. You mentioned that you don't know how to let people help you, and I keep coming back to that. I think part of the reason I've enjoyed our friendship so much is that you never made me feel like I was just another person trying to fix Harry Potter. You talked to me like I was just Katie, someone whose opinion mattered because of who I was, rather than what I represented. I want you to know that the feeling is mutual. When I'm with you, I'm not the girl who's desperate to prove herself worthy of her Hogwarts letter, or the daughter trying to bridge two different worlds, or the chaser who's terrified of letting down her team. I'm just me, and somehow that feels like enough. I've been having dreams about flying, not nightmares about the attack, thankfully, but proper dreams about Quidditch matches and clear skies, and the feeling of wind in my face. When I wake up, the first thing I think about is how much I want to share those dreams with you, to tell you about the impossible catches and perfect passes that my sleeping mind conjures up. It's strange how even unconscious happiness feels incomplete when there's no one to share it with. I'm hoping to have another visitor day soon. The healers mentioned something about family visitation, though I suspect they're mostly trying to manage my mother's increasing tendency to appear unannounced, with home-cooked meals and detailed questions about my treatment. If you're able to visit again, I'd love to see you. There's something about letter writing that makes it easier to say things you might not manage face-to-face, but I miss the sound of your voice. Write soon. Katie P.S. I've enclosed the runic love poetry I mentioned. See if you can spot the grammatical error that turns radiant as the aurora into resembling a turnip. I'm curious whether your ancient runes has improved enough to catch such subtleties. Harry found himself smiling as he finished Katie's letter, her warmth and humour managing to reach across the distance between Hogwarts and St. Mungo's. But beneath his pleasure in her words, he felt the familiar twist of anxiety that had been his constant companion since the night she'd been attacked. Katie's observation about the cursed necklace being meant for someone else confirmed his own growing suspicions, though it did nothing to ease his worry about her safety. More troubling was her casual mention of dreams and wanting to share them with him, of missing his voice and hoping for another visit. The words carried an intimacy that went beyond simple friendship, but Harry found himself afraid to read too much into them. Katie was isolated and probably lonely. Of course, she would cling to connections with the outside world. The fact that she seemed to value his companionship might not mean anything more than that he was a familiar face in an unfamiliar situation. But then he read her postscript about the runic poetry and found himself laughing out loud, startling several first years who were trying to study nearby. This was pure Katie, finding humour in academic minutiae, challenging him to improve his translation skills while she was lying in a hospital bed. No one else in Harry's life would think to include butchered love poetry as educational material, and the gesture felt achingly personal, despite its academic wrapper. Harry's third letter was longer than his previous efforts, filled with details about his classes and updates on mutual friends, but also with more personal observations about his daily life at Hogwarts. He wrote about his continuing struggles with advanced potions, where Slughorn's teaching style seemed designed to confuse as much as educate. He described Ron's latest romantic disaster, a spectacularly unsuccessful attempt to ask out a Hufflepuff 7th year that had ended with Ron hiding in an empty classroom for 2 hours to avoid facing her again. But more than external events, Harry found himself writing about internal ones. His increasing anxiety about the war, his complicated feelings about Dumbledore's mysterious absences, his growing sense that he was missing something important about the threats facing the wizarding world. It was easier to articulate these fears on parchment than it had ever been in conversation, as if the act of writing created a buffer that made honesty possible. "I keep having this dream," he wrote, "where I'm standing in the middle of a battle, but I can't see who I'm supposed to be fighting. Everyone around me knows what they're supposed to do, but I'm just standing there with my wand in my hand, waiting for someone to tell me where to point it. I wake up feeling like I should be preparing for something, but I don't know what. Sometimes I think about what you said that night in the classroom, about how I try to carry everything myself because I'm afraid of letting people down. You were right, but it's more complicated than just fear of failure. It's the growing certainty that whatever's coming, whatever Voldemort is planning, it's going to come down to me in the end. And if that's true, then getting other people involved just puts them in danger without actually helping solve the problem. But then I remember you saying that when I punish myself for things that aren't my fault, I'm making people watch someone they care about suffer. And I think maybe you're right about that too. Maybe there's a difference between protecting people and pushing them away, even if I can't always see it. I wish you were here to help me make sense of it all. You have this way of cutting through my tendency toward dramatic overthinking and getting straight to the heart of things. Right now I feel like I'm drowning in possibilities and consequences, and I could really use someone to throw me a rope." Katie's response came by return post, and Harry could practically hear her voice in the confident cadence of her words. "Harry, first of all, stop calling him you-know-who in private correspondence. His name is Voldemort, and if you're going to spend time worrying about him, you might as well use his actual name. Fear of a name only increases fear of the thing itself, and you're brave enough to face the reality without hiding behind euphemisms. Second, you're not drowning in possibilities. You're trying to solve a problem that doesn't have a solution yet, because you don't have all the information. That's not the same thing as failure. That's just life. Nobody expects you to have all the answers, despite what the Daily Prophet might suggest about the capabilities of the boy who lived. I've been thinking about what you said regarding carrying everything yourself, and I think you're missing something important. You're not meant to solve the Voldemort problem alone, because it's not actually your problem alone. It's everyone's problem, the entire wizarding world's problem. You just happen to be the person with the most direct connection to it. Think about it this way. If there was a cursed object loose in Hogwarts, would you expect to handle it entirely by yourself? Of course not. You'd tell McGonagall, or Dumbledore, or at minimum you'd involve Ron and Hermione in figuring out what to do about it. The fact that this particular problem involves ancient magic and prophecies doesn't change the fundamental principle. You're not meant to face it alone, because nobody is meant to face anything truly important alone. As for your dreams about not knowing who to fight, maybe the problem isn't that you can't see your enemy clearly. Maybe the problem is that you're looking for a single target when the real battle is much bigger and more complicated than that. Voldemort is a symptom of something larger, a particular manifestation of the kind of thinking that divides people into pure and impure, worthy and unworthy, us and them. You can't defeat that with a single, well-aimed curse, no matter how powerful. But you can fight it by refusing to accept those divisions, by insisting that Muggle-born witches deserve the same education as purebloods, by treating house elves like beings worthy of respect rather than property, by seeing people like me, half-bloods, caught between two worlds, as bridges rather than problems to be solved. You've been doing that kind of fighting for years, Harry, even if you don't think of it in those terms. Every time you stand up for someone who's being bullied, every time you question authority that seems more interested in maintaining order than protecting people, every time you choose to see individuals instead of categories, that's how you fight the real war. I know this probably sounds like philosophical nonsense when you're worried about actual battles with actual dark wizards, but I think the reason you feel so uncertain about what you're supposed to be fighting is that you're looking for the wrong kind of enemy. The real enemy isn't one person, no matter how powerful. It's the mindset that makes someone like Voldemort possible in the first place. I'm sorry if this is more heavy-handed advice than you were looking for. Hospital beds apparently make me philosophical, but I want you to know that I believe in you, not because of your scar or your survival record, but because of who you choose to be every day. You're going to figure out what you need to figure out, and you're not going to do it alone. I miss you too, more than I should probably admit in a letter. Harry read Katie's letter so many times that he could recite entire paragraphs from memory. Her words felt like a lifeline thrown across the weeks of separation, a reminder that someone understood not just his fears, but the deeper questions underlying them. Nobody else in his life, not Ron or Hermione, not even Dumbledore, had ever articulated so clearly the distinction between fighting symptoms and fighting causes, between defeating individual enemies and changing the systems that created them. But more than her philosophical insights, what struck Harry most powerfully was the casual intimacy of her final line, more than I should probably admit in a letter. The words suggested that Katie was holding back, that there were things she might say in person that felt too revealing for written correspondence. The possibility that her feelings might mirror his own sent a warm flutter through his chest that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with hope. His response was the longest letter he'd ever written, filled with his own philosophical reflections and increasingly personal revelations about his past and his fears for the future. He wrote about his guilt over Sirius's death, about the weight of the prophecy that hung over him like a sword, about his growing certainty that he was running out of time to become whoever he needed to be to face Voldemort. But he also wrote about lighter things, his amusement at Ron's ongoing romantic disasters, his appreciation for Hermione's unwavering loyalty, his gratitude for friends who saw past his fame to the person underneath. And woven throughout, sometimes explicitly, and sometimes between the lines, he wrote about Katie herself, how much her letters meant to him, how her perspective helped him see his own situation more clearly, how the thought of her recovery was one of the few bright spots in an increasingly dark world. I keep thinking about what you said about seeing bridges instead of problems, he wrote near the end of the letter. You've been a bridge for me, Katie, between the person I thought I had to be and the person I actually am. I don't know if that makes sense, but knowing you has made me feel more like myself than I have in years. I can't wait for you to come back to Hogwarts, not just because I miss our study sessions or because the Quidditch team needs you, but because I miss you. I miss the way you laugh at my terrible jokes and challenge my assumptions and make everything seem more manageable. I miss having someone in my life who sees Harry before they see the boy who lived. The healers are right about one thing. Life is too short and too uncertain to waste time hiding from the truth. So here's my truth. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone who wasn't related to me or trying to save my life. I don't know exactly what that means yet, but I know I want to figure it out with you when you're well enough to come home. Until then, keep getting better. Keep writing to me. Keep being exactly who you are. Harry P.S. I solved your runic poetry puzzle. The poet conjugated radiant as if it were a root vegetable rather than a quality of light. Either he was very bad at grammar or he had some extremely specific romantic preferences. I'm hoping it was the grammar. Katie's response came faster than usual, and when Harry unfolded it, he found a much shorter message written in handwriting that seemed to vibrate with emotion. Harry, I got your letter this morning, and I've read it 6 times. I keep starting to write a response, and then stopping because I don't know how to match what you gave me with words of my own. You asked about bridges and whether that made sense. It makes perfect sense. You've been a bridge for me too. Between the girl who was afraid she wasn't good enough for the wizarding world and the woman who's finally starting to believe she belongs exactly where she is. I care about you too, Harry. More than I should probably say in a letter that I'm sending to a castle full of gossiping teenagers. More than I expected to when I found you crying in that dusty classroom. More than is entirely reasonable, given that we've only really known each other for a few months. But here's what I've learned from lying in a hospital bed for weeks. Reasonable is overrated. Life is too short and too fragile to waste time pretending you don't feel things that you do feel. So yes, I want to figure it out with you too. Whatever it turns out to be. The healers say I should be well enough for another visit next week if you're able to come. There are things I want to tell you that don't belong in letters, conversations I want to have that require seeing your face when you respond. Until then, keep being exactly who you are too. The Harry who writes long, thoughtful letters and solves runic puzzles and sees bridges instead of barriers. The Harry who cares too much and tries too hard and somehow always manages to be exactly what people need him to be, whether he realizes it or not. I'll see you soon. Harry folded Katie's letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket, where it seemed to radiate warmth against his ribs. Around him, the great hall buzzed with the usual morning chaos, students complaining about homework, arguing about Quidditch prospects, gossiping about who was dating whom. It all felt distant somehow, as if he were observing it from behind glass. Good news from Katie? Hermione asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Yeah, Harry said, unable to suppress the smile that seemed to have taken permanent residence on his face. Very good news. About time, Ron said, around a mouthful of toast. You two have been dancing around each other in letters for weeks. It was getting painful to watch. We haven't been dancing around anything, Harry protested, though even as he said it, he realized Ron was probably right. Harry, Hermione said gently, you've been carrying those letters around like they contain state secrets, and every time you get one, you disappear for hours and come back, looking either blissfully happy or vaguely tormented. That's not normal correspondence behavior. Harry opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again as he realized she was right about that too. He had been treating Katie's letters like precious artifacts, reading and rereading them until he could recite entire passages from memory. He'd been scheduling his days around owl deliveries, watching the sky during meals in case her distinctive brown owl might appear with another message. When had Katie Bell become the gravitational center around which his entire emotional life revolved? The answer, when it came to him, was both obvious and slightly terrifying, gradually, and then all at once. Their friendship had developed slowly, built on shared study sessions and casual conversations, and the gradual accumulation of trust. But somewhere in the weeks since her attack, something had shifted. The possibility of losing her had crystallized his feelings into something sharper and more urgent than simple affection. I think I'm in love with her, Harry said quietly, the words coming out before he'd consciously decided to speak them. Ron nearly choked on his pumpkin juice. Well, that's not exactly breaking news, mate. It's not? Harry asked, surprised. Harry, Hermione said with fond exasperation, you've been completely gone on Katie Bell since that first night she found you crying after the Quidditch match. Possibly before that, if I'm being honest. The only person who didn't seem to realize it was you. Harry stared at his best friends, feeling oddly like the last person to arrive at a party that had been planned in his honor. Was I really that obvious? Painfully obvious, Ron confirmed. You got that same dopey expression every time someone mentioned her name, and after she was attacked, you went a bit mental for a while there. We were starting to worry you might do something dramatically stupid. Like what? Like charging off to St. Mungo's without permission, or confronting Malfoy without proof, or generally behaving like someone whose brain had been replaced with romantic poetry, Hermione said dryly. Harry felt his cheeks warm. I wasn't that bad. You spent 3 hours staring at the hospital ward entrance the first day she was attacked, Ron pointed out. And when McGonagall finally let you visit, you came back looking like someone had told you Christmas was being cancelled forever. That's because I realized I was in love with her, and she called me her friend, Harry said, then immediately regretted the admission. Hermione's expression softened into something approaching sympathy. Oh, Harry, you really don't know anything about women, do you? Apparently not. When a woman calls you her friend while she's lying in a hospital bed, recovering from a curse attack, she's not rejecting you. She's being careful. She's protecting herself from disappointment in case her feelings aren't reciprocated. Hermione leaned forward, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when explaining particularly complex theoretical concepts. The fact that Katie kept writing to you, that she shared personal thoughts and fears, that she admitted to missing you more than she should, those aren't the actions of someone who thinks of you as just a friend. You really think so? I think, Hermione said gently, that you should probably have that conversation she mentioned sooner rather than later. Some things are too important to leave to letters and assumptions. Harry nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and terror that was becoming familiar whenever he thought about Katie and the future they might build together. In a few days, he'd see her again, not as a worried friend visiting an injured teammate, but as someone who'd finally admitted to himself what he wanted and was ready to find out if she wanted it too. The possibility was both thrilling and absolutely terrifying. But then again, Harry thought, as he watched Hermione and Ron exchange one of their loaded glances that seemed to communicate entire conversations, the best things in life usually were. Chapter 6. Return. Harry had been checking the Great Hall entrance every few minutes for the past 3 hours, a habit that was beginning to earn him concerned looks from his housemates and increasingly pointed comments from Ron about the virtues of patience. It was ridiculous behavior, he knew that, but knowing something intellectually and managing to stop doing it were apparently two entirely different skills. Katie was coming back today. After 6 weeks at St. Mungo's, countless letters that had grown progressively more intimate and revealing, and a correspondence that had fundamentally altered Harry's understanding of what it meant to care about someone, Katie Bell was finally returning to Hogwarts. The knowledge should have been purely exciting, but instead, Harry found himself cycling between anticipation and a kind of paralyzing anxiety that made it difficult to focus on anything else. What if the person who stepped through those doors wasn't the same Katie who'd written him those letters? What if the intimacy they'd built through written words felt forced and artificial when they were face to face again? What if the weeks of separation had given Katie time to reconsider whatever feelings she'd hinted at in her correspondence, and she'd decided that Harry Potter was more trouble than any relationship was worth? Mate, Ron said for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. She's going to show up when she shows up. Staring at the door isn't going to make her arrive any faster. I'm not staring, Harry protested, though even as he said it, he realized his eyes had drifted back toward the entrance. You're definitely staring, Hermione said, without looking up from her ancient runes homework. You've been staring for most of dinner, and frankly, it's making everyone uncomfortable. Dean asked me if you were expecting an attack. Harry felt his cheeks warm. I'm just keeping an eye out. For Katie, who sent a letter 3 days ago saying she'd be back sometime this week, but didn't specify when, Ron said. Which means she could arrive any time between now and Sunday, and you're going to drive yourself mental if you keep this up. Harry knew Ron was right. but the rational knowledge did nothing to ease the tight feeling in his chest that had been building since Katie's last letter. Her final message had been shorter than usual, written in handwriting that seemed shakier than her previous correspondence, and the contents had been oddly formal, considering the intimacy they'd developed over weeks of written conversation. Harry, the healers have cleared me to return to Hogwarts. I should arrive sometime late this week, depending on when my parents can arrange to drive me up from London. I'm looking forward to seeing you and catching up on everything I've missed. I hope the ancient runes revision is going well. Professor Babbling will probably want me to catch up on the coursework I missed, so I may need to take advantage of your improved translation skills. See you soon. Katie. The letter had felt like a step backward from the emotional honesty of their previous exchanges, and Harry couldn't decide whether Katie was being cautious about committing her feelings to parchment one final time, or whether she'd reconsidered the entire trajectory of their correspondence during her final days at St. Mungo's. Maybe she's having second thoughts, Harry said quietly, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him for days. About what? Hermione asked, finally looking up from her homework. About everything. About what we wrote to each other. About whatever this is between us. Harry gestured vaguely, as if he could physically indicate the complicated tangle of emotions that Katie Bell had become in his life. Her last letter was different. More distant. Or, Hermione suggested gently, she was nervous about seeing you again and didn't want to put too much pressure on the reunion by writing something overly emotional. You think so? I think, Ron said, that you're overthinking this to a degree that would impress even Hermione. Katie's been writing to you for weeks about how much she cares about you and how she wants to figure out what you mean to each other. That doesn't strike me as the kind of sentiment that changes overnight. Harry wanted to believe Ron was right, but the doubt had taken root and was proving difficult to dislodge. 6 weeks was a long time to build a relationship through letters, but it was also a long time for someone to reconsider decisions made in the aftermath of a traumatic attack. Katie had been vulnerable and isolated when their correspondence began. What if her feelings had been more about loneliness and proximity than genuine affection? There, Hermione said suddenly, nodding toward the Great Hall entrance. I think that's her. Harry's head snapped up so quickly he nearly gave himself whiplash. There, standing in the doorway with a travel bag slung over her shoulder and her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, was Katie Bell. She looked different. Not dramatically so. She was still recognizably herself, still the girl who'd found Harry crying in a dusty classroom and had somehow managed to become the most important person in his world. But there were subtle changes that spoke to the weeks she'd spent away from Hogwarts. She was paler than Harry remembered, and there was a carefulness to the way she moved that suggested she was still recovering from her ordeal. Her eyes seemed larger in her face, and when she scanned the Great Hall with obvious nervousness, Harry caught a glimpse of uncertainty that he'd never associated with Katie Bell before. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment that felt like it lasted hours, neither of them moved. Harry found himself cataloguing every detail of her appearance, the way her travel robes hung slightly loose on her frame, the small scar on her collarbone that he'd never noticed before, the particular shade of relief and anxiety that flickered across her expression when she spotted him. Then Katie was walking toward the Gryffindor table, and Harry was standing up to meet her, and suddenly they were face to face for the first time since that hospital room at St. Mungo's. "Hi," Katie said, and her voice was exactly as Harry remembered it, warm and slightly husky and utterly familiar despite the weeks of separation. "Hi," Harry replied, and then they were just standing there looking at each other, both apparently struck speechless by the surreal experience of seeing someone in person after weeks of intimate correspondence. "Welcome back, Katie," Hermione said, stepping smoothly into the silence. "How was the journey from London?" "Long," Katie said, though she didn't take her eyes off Harry. "My parents insisted on driving rather than using the flu network. I think they wanted to delay letting me out of their sight for as long as possible. Can't blame them for that, Ron said. After what happened, well, I imagine they're not thrilled about you being back at school. Katie's expression darkened slightly. They wanted me to finish the term at home, actually. Complete my newts through private tutoring and avoid Hogwarts entirely until the war situation stabilizes. She paused, seeming to realize that she was discussing family tensions in front of half the Gryffindor table. But I convinced them that I needed to be here, that hiding wasn't going to solve anything. Harry felt a stab of guilt at the casual mention of the war situation. In his excitement about Katie's return, he'd almost managed to forget that her attack had been connected to larger, more dangerous forces, that her presence at Hogwarts might still put her at risk. "Are you sure you're ready to be back?" he asked, the words coming out more worried than welcoming. Katie's expression shifted, and Harry caught a flash of something that looked almost like hurt. "I've been cleared by the healers, if that's what you're asking. I'm not going to collapse or have some kind of episode during Transfiguration." "That's not what I meant," Harry said quickly, realizing he'd managed to put his foot in his mouth within the first 5 minutes of Katie's return. "I just meant, are you sure you feel safe here? After what happened?" "Safer than I'd feel at home, wondering what was happening to my friends while I hid behind my parents' protective charms," Katie said, and there was an edge to her voice that Harry had never heard before. "I'm not made of glass, Harry. I don't need to be protected from my own life." The words hit Harry like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were so obviously true. In his concern for Katie's well-being, he'd immediately assumed that she was fragile, that she needed to be shielded from potential danger rather than trusted to make her own decisions about risk and safety. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "I know what you meant," Katie said, her voice gentling slightly, "and I appreciate the concern, really. But I've spent 6 weeks having every decision made for me by people who thought they knew what was best for my recovery. I was hoping things would be different here." There was a weight to her words that suggested they were about more than just Harry's immediate reaction to her return. Katie was drawing a line in the sand, establishing that she wanted to be treated as a competent adult rather than a victim in need of protection. "Right," Harry said, feeling like he was navigating a conversation that had suddenly become much more complicated than he'd expected. "Of course. I missed you, and I'm glad you're back." Something in Katie's expression softened at that, and for the first time since she'd walked through the great hall doors, she looked like the girl who'd written him weeks of intimate letters about dreams and fears and the growing certainty that they meant something to each other. "I missed you too," she said quietly. The conversation resumed around them, Ron asking about Katie's recovery, Hermione inquiring about the coursework she'd need to catch up on, other Gryffindors offering welcomes and asking polite questions about her health. But Harry found himself only dimly aware of the broader discussion, his attention fixed entirely on Katie and the subtle ways she seemed different from the person he remembered. She was more guarded now, he realized, more careful in her responses, quicker to deflect personal questions with humor or redirected attention. The easy openness that had characterized her letters was still there, but it felt more controlled somehow, as if she'd learned to ration her vulnerability rather than offering it freely. When the dinner crowd began to thin out, Katie excused herself to visit McGonagall and arrange her return to classes. As she gathered her things, she caught Harry's eye with a look that he couldn't quite interpret. "Walk with me?" she asked quietly. Harry nodded, falling into step beside her as they left the great hall. The corridors of Hogwarts felt different at night, shadows stretching long and dark between the flickering torches, their footsteps echoing off stone walls that had stood for centuries. It was the kind of atmosphere that should have been romantic, but instead Harry found himself acutely aware of the careful distance Katie maintained between them as they walked. "So," Katie said when they'd been walking in silence for several minutes, Your letters. Harry's stomach dropped. What about them? They were... Katie paused, seeming to search for the right words. Intense. More personal than I expected when we started corresponding. Too personal? Harry asked, dreading the answer. No, Katie said quickly. Not too personal. Just different from what I was prepared for. She glanced at him sideways, and Harry caught a glimpse of the uncertainty he'd noticed when she first entered the great hall. I keep wondering if what we wrote to each other was real, or if it was just... I don't know. The product of isolation and worry and being stuck in a hospital room for weeks. The question hit Harry like a curse to the chest. After weeks of building intimacy through letters, after finally admitting to himself that he was falling in love with Katie Bell, she was questioning whether any of it had been genuine. It was real for me, Harry said quietly. Everything I wrote to you, everything I told you, it was all real. Katie was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the corridor ahead of them. The thing is, she said finally, it's easy to be honest in letters. You have time to think about what you want to say, time to craft your words until they sound exactly right. Face-to-face is different. Messier. Is that what you think? Harry asked, stopping in the middle of the corridor. That I was just crafting words? That I was performing honesty rather than actually being honest? Katie stopped too, turning to face him with an expression that was both vulnerable and defensive. I think that letters can make people seem more compatible than they actually are. I think it's possible to fall in love with someone's written voice and then discover that the real person is different. And what if they're not different? Harry asked, stepping closer to her. What if the person you got to know through letters is exactly who I am when I'm not trying to be anyone else? Katie looked up at him, and Harry could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. She wanted to believe him, he realized, but something was holding her back. Some fear or uncertainty that had developed during her weeks away from Hogwarts. I don't know, she admitted quietly. I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out. They were standing close enough now that Harry could see the faint scar on Katie's collarbone where the cursed necklace had touched her skin. The physical reminder of her attack sent a surge of protective anger through him, followed immediately by guilt for his earlier assumption that she needed protection. Katie, he said softly. What are you afraid of? The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Harry thought she might deflect it, the way she'd been deflecting personal inquiries all evening. Instead, she took a shaky breath and met his eyes directly. I'm afraid that I'm more damaged than I want to admit, she said. I'm afraid that the person who wrote those letters to you was someone I was pretending to be while I was stuck in a hospital bed. Someone braver and more certain than I actually am. I'm afraid that now that I'm back in the real world, with real pressures and real dangers, I'll disappoint you. The raw honesty of her confession took Harry's breath away. This was the Katie from the letters, vulnerable, thoughtful, willing to voice fears that most people would keep hidden. She hadn't changed as much as he'd worried. She'd just learned to be more careful about when and how she revealed herself. Katie, Harry said, reaching out to touch her arm gently. The person who wrote me those letters is the person standing in front of me right now. The person who's brave enough to come back to Hogwarts, despite what happened, brave enough to tell me what she's really afraid of, instead of pretending everything's fine. Katie's eyes filled with tears that she tried to blink away. What if it's not enough? What if I'm not strong enough to be whatever this is that we're trying to figure out? Then we'll figure it out together, Harry said, the words coming easily despite the complexity of what he was promising. Katie, I don't need you to be perfect. I don't need you to be some idealized version of yourself from letters. I just need you to be you, the real you, with all the fears and uncertainties and complicated feelings that come with being human. Katy stared at him for a long moment, and Harry could see her weighing his words against whatever internal doubts she'd been carrying. Then, slowly, some of the tension left her shoulders. "The real me is pretty messy right now," she warned. "Good," Harry said with a small smile. "I've got enough practice being messy for both of us." That earned him a shaky laugh, and suddenly the careful distance Katy had been maintaining between them seemed less necessary. She stepped closer, close enough that Harry could smell her familiar shampoo and see the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks in the flickering torchlight. "Harry," she said softly. "Yeah? I missed you too. More than I probably should have." The words were an echo of her letters, a bridge between the intimacy they'd built through written correspondence and the tentative connection they were rebuilding in person. Harry felt his heart skip in a way that was becoming familiar whenever Katy said things that revealed the depth of her feelings. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "I was starting to worry that maybe you'd changed your mind about whatever this is." "I haven't changed my mind," Katy said, and there was a certainty in her voice that hadn't been there earlier. "I'm still scared, and I'm still not sure I know what I'm doing, but I haven't changed my mind about wanting to figure it out with you." They were standing very close now, close enough that Harry could feel the warmth radiating from Katy's skin despite the cool air of the corridor. Her eyes were fixed on his, and he could see his own uncertainty and hope reflected back at him in her dark gaze. "Katy," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Can I?" "Yes," she said quickly, before he could finish the question. Harry leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. But Katy met him halfway. Their lips touched softly at first, tentatively, as if they were both afraid that too much pressure might shatter whatever fragile thing they were building between them. The kiss was nothing like Harry's previous romantic experiences, not desperate like his encounters with Cho, not complicated by guilt and confusion like his few kisses with Ginny. It was gentle and sweet, and tasted faintly of the pumpkin juice Katy had drunk at dinner. But more than the physical sensation, what struck Harry was the sense of rightness, the way Katy's hand came up to rest against his chest, and the way she sighed softly against his lips, as if she were finally allowing herself to relax. "Harry, there you are. We've been— Oh." The voice came from behind Harry, and he and Katy sprang apart as if they'd been cursed. Harry turned to find Dean Thomas standing at the intersection of two corridors, his eyes wide with surprise and obvious embarrassment at having interrupted what was clearly a private moment. "Sorry," Dean said quickly, taking a step backward. "I didn't mean to. I was just looking for you because Ron wanted to know if you'd seen his transfiguration notes. But I can see you're— I'll just tell him you're busy." "Dean, wait!" Harry called. But Dean was already retreating rapidly down the corridor, clearly eager to escape the awkward situation he'd stumbled into. Harry turned back to Katy, who was pressing her hands to her flushed cheeks with an expression of mortification. "Well," she said weakly, "that was subtle." "Dean's not going to tell anyone," Harry said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Dean was generally trustworthy, but news of Harry Potter kissing Katy Bell in a Hogwarts corridor was exactly the kind of gossip that had a way of spreading regardless of good intentions. "Isn't he?" Katy asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was thinking along the same lines. "Harry, I don't know if I'm ready for the entire castle to know about whatever this is. I just got back, and I'm still figuring out how to be normal again. Adding relationship gossip to the mix feels like too much." Harry felt a stab of disappointment at the suggestion that they should keep their evolving relationship secret. But he could understand Katy's reasoning. She was still recovering, still readjusting to life at Hogwarts, still dealing with the aftermath of her attack. The last thing she needed was to become the subject of castle-wide speculation about her love life. "All right," he said. "We'll keep it quiet for now, just until you're ready to deal with other people's opinions." Katie's expression softened with gratitude. "Thank you. It's not that I'm ashamed of this. I just need some time to figure out what it is before everyone else starts weighing in with their thoughts." "I understand," Harry said, and he did, even though part of him wanted to shout from the great hall rafters that Katie Bell was back and safe and apparently interested in kissing him in empty corridors. They walked back toward Gryffindor Tower in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the evening's revelations. The kiss had been brief and interrupted, but it had answered the question that had been haunting Harry for weeks. The intimacy they'd built through letters was real, and it translated into something equally powerful in person. As they reached the portrait of the fat lady, Katie caught his arm gently. "Harry," she said, "thank you for being patient with me tonight, for understanding why I was scared, for being exactly who I hoped you'd be." Harry felt his chest warm with affection, and something deeper, something that was beginning to feel very much like love. "Thank you for coming back, for taking the risk of figuring this out with me." Katie smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded expression Harry had seen from her since she'd walked through the great hall doors. "I wouldn't miss it," she said softly. The fat lady's portrait swung open, and they climbed through into the common room, where a handful of students were scattered around the fireplace, working on late assignments or playing chess. Harry caught sight of Ron and Hermione sitting together on one of the sofas, their heads bent close over what appeared to be a Defense Against the Dark Arts textbook. "Harry," Ron called when he spotted them, "did you find my transfiguration notes? Dean said he'd seen you, but then he got all weird and wouldn't tell us where." Harry felt Katie tense beside him at the reminder of their interrupted kiss. "I haven't seen your notes, Ron. Are you sure you didn't leave them in the dormitory?" "I've looked everywhere," Ron said, then seemed to notice Katie for the first time. "Oh, hello again, Katie. Getting settled back in all right?" "Slowly but surely," Katie said, and Harry could hear the effort it took for her to sound casual. "I should probably get up to the dormitory, actually. It's been a long day." She said goodbye to Ron and Hermione, then caught Harry's eye with a look that somehow managed to convey both affection and uncertainty. "See you tomorrow?" she asked quietly. "See you tomorrow," Harry confirmed. He watched her climb the stairs to the girls' dormitories, then turned to find Ron and Hermione studying him with expressions of barely contained curiosity. "So," Hermione said carefully, "how did it go?" "How did what go?" "Your reunion with Katie," Ron said. "You've been nervous about it all week, and now you're both acting like you've got some kind of secret." Harry felt his cheeks warm. Trust Ron and Hermione to notice the subtle dynamics immediately. "It went fine," he said, aiming for casual, and probably missing by several degrees. "She's still adjusting to being back, but she seems well." "Right," Hermione said dryly, "and that's why you both look like you've been caught doing something you shouldn't, and why Dean came back from looking for you with that particular expression people get when they've interrupted something private." "Did Dean say something?" Harry asked, trying not to sound as worried as he felt. "He said he found you and Katie having what he diplomatically described as an intense conversation," Ron said. "But given that you both look guilty and flustered, I'm guessing it was the kind of intense conversation that involves considerably less talking than usual." Harry opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again as he realized there was no point in trying to lie to his best friends. They knew him too well, and they'd already figured out most of what had happened anyway. "All right. Yes," he said quietly. "We kissed. But Katie wants to keep things quiet for now, while she adjusts to being back. So I'd appreciate it if you didn't spread it around." "Of course we won't spread it around," Hermione said, though she was smiling in a way that suggested she was pleased by this development. "But Harry, I'm happy for you. You and Katie seem really good together." "We're taking it slowly," Harry said, "figuring things out as we go." "That's probably wise," Ron said. "After everything that's happened, you both deserve to take your time and do this right." Harry nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for friends who understood without needing extensive explanation. Ron and Hermione had watched his relationship with Katie develop from worried friendship to something deeper, and they'd supported him through all the uncertainty and anxiety that had come with it. As he made his way up to his dormitory later that night, Harry found himself replaying the evening's events in his mind. Katie's initial distance and uncertainty, their conversation about the letters, the moment when she'd allowed herself to be vulnerable again. The kiss that had been soft and sweet and full of promise, even if it had been interrupted before it could develop into something deeper. But more than any specific moment, what stayed with Harry was the overall sense of rightness, the feeling that despite all the complications and uncertainties, he and Katie Bell were building something worth the effort it was taking to figure out. She was back at Hogwarts. She was safe, and she wanted to continue exploring whatever was developing between them. After weeks of separation and worry, that felt like more than enough to build on. Tomorrow they'd see each other in classes, sit together during meals, return to the easy friendship that had been the foundation for everything else. But underneath the familiar rhythms of school life, there would be the new awareness of what they meant to each other, the memory of that brief kiss and the promise of whatever might come next. For the first time in months, Harry fell asleep feeling genuinely optimistic about the future. Chapter 7. Secret Moments. The thing about secret relationships, Harry discovered, was that they required a completely different set of skills than he'd ever needed to develop. Skills like maintaining casual conversation, while hyper-aware of every glance and gesture, like finding excuses to be in the same places at the same times without seeming obvious, like remembering which expressions and tones of voice were appropriate for public consumption versus private moments. It had been 2 weeks since Katie's return to Hogwarts, 2 weeks since their interrupted kiss in the corridor, and Harry was fairly certain he was terrible at all of it. "You're staring again," Hermione murmured, without looking up from her ancient runes homework. Harry blinked, focusing on his best friend with the guilty awareness that she was absolutely right. He had been staring at Katie, who was sitting 3 tables away in the library with Alicia Spinett, working through what appeared to be a particularly complex arithmancy problem. Katie's hair was falling in her face as she bent over her parchment, and she kept tucking it behind her ear in a gesture that Harry found utterly distracting, despite having seen it hundreds of times. "I wasn't staring," Harry said automatically, then caught Hermione's skeptical expression. "All right, maybe I was staring a little, but it's not obvious staring. It's subtle, observational staring." "There's no such thing as subtle staring," Ron said from across the table, where he was making his usual valiant attempt to understand transfiguration theory. "And you've been doing it constantly since Katie got back. It's like watching someone try to solve a puzzle they can't quite figure out." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Harry felt like he was trying to solve a puzzle, the puzzle of how to be in a relationship with someone when that relationship had to remain invisible to everyone around them. 2 weeks in, and he still hadn't figured out the basic mechanics of it. The secrecy had been Katie's idea, and Harry understood her reasoning. She was still readjusting to life at Hogwarts, still dealing with the aftermath of her attack, still trying to find her footing in a world that felt simultaneously familiar and changed. Adding the pressure of public scrutiny about her love life would have been too much, too soon. But understanding the reasoning and being comfortable with the reality were 2 entirely different things. Harry missed being able to sit beside Katie during meals, missed walking to classes with her, without carefully calculated coincidences, missed the easy physical affection that had been growing between them before they'd decided to hide it from the world. Instead, their relationship had become a series of stolen moments, brief conversations in empty corridors, hands brushing as they passed in crowded hallways, meaningful glances across rooms full of oblivious classmates. It was romantic in theory, but exhausting in practice. "Harry!" Katie's voice came from behind him, and Harry turned to find her standing beside his table with her bag slung over her shoulder. "Could I borrow your notes from defense? I'm still catching up on what I missed while I was away." "Of course," Harry said, pulling out his defense notebook and handing it to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it, a contact so brief that anyone watching would assume it was accidental, but long enough for Harry to feel the familiar flutter in his chest that Katie's touch always caused. "Thanks," Katie said, and there was something in her eyes that suggested the notebook wasn't the only thing she wanted. "I'll get it back to you later." "No rush," Harry replied, trying to match her casual tone despite the way his pulse had quickened. Katie smiled, a perfectly friendly, perfectly appropriate smile that revealed nothing about the fact that they'd spent an hour the previous evening hidden in an alcove on the 4th floor, talking about everything and nothing while Harry played with her fingers and wondered when touching Katie Bell had become as essential as breathing. "See you around," she said, then walked away with the kind of easy confidence that made it look like borrowing study notes from Harry Potter was the most natural thing in the world. "Smooth," Ron commented, once Katie was out of earshot. "Very subtle. Nobody would ever suspect that there's something going on between you two." Harry felt his cheeks warm. "There's nothing going on." "Harry," Hermione interrupted gently, "we're your best friends. We've watched you pine after Katie Bell for months. We saw how you reacted when she was attacked, and we're not blind to the way you two have been looking at each other since she got back. You don't have to pretend with us." The casual revelation that his feelings had been obvious to his friends for months should have been embarrassing, but instead Harry felt a wave of relief. Keeping the secret from Ron and Hermione had been one of the hardest parts of the whole arrangement, not because he didn't trust them, but because hiding things from the people who knew him best felt fundamentally wrong. "Katie wants to keep it quiet for now," Harry said quietly. "She's still adjusting to being back, and she doesn't want to deal with the whole school speculating about her personal life." "That's understandable," Hermione said. "After what she's been through, the last thing she needs is to become the subject of castle gossip." "But you are together?" Ron asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Officially, I mean." Harry considered the question, trying to figure out how to explain the complicated reality of their relationship. They weren't officially anything, as far as he knew. They'd kissed exactly once, spent several evenings talking in hidden corners of the castle, and exchanged the kind of meaningful looks that made Harry's stomach do interesting things. But they'd never actually discussed what they were to each other, never put labels on whatever was developing between them. "We're figuring it out," Harry said finally, taking it slowly. "Good," Hermione said firmly. "You both deserve to take your time with this. And Harry, we won't say anything to anyone else. Your secret is safe with us." The promise should have been comforting, but instead it reminded Harry of how many secrets he was already keeping, how many aspects of his life required careful management and strategic omissions. Sometimes he felt like he was living 3 different lives simultaneously. The public Harry Potter who belonged to the wizarding world, the private Harry who shared his fears and struggles with his closest friends, and now this new, secret Harry who was learning what it meant to care about someone in ways he'd never experienced before. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating in ways that made the exhaustion seem worthwhile. That evening, Harry made his way to the 7th floor with Katie's notebook tucked under his arm and his heart beating slightly faster than usual. They'd developed a routine over the past 2 weeks, casual encounters in public spaces that provided excuses for private conversations, study sessions in empty classrooms that lasted longer than strictly necessary for academic purposes, walks that somehow ended in secluded areas of the castle where they could talk without fear of interruption. Tonight, Katie had suggested meeting near the Room of Requirement, a choice that felt both practical and symbolic. The Room of Requirement was a space that became whatever its user needed most, and what Harry needed most these days was somewhere he could be himself with Katie without having to perform casual friendship for an audience. He found her waiting in the corridor, leaning against the wall with his defense notebook in her hands, and an expression that was carefully neutral despite the way her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Thanks for this," she said, holding up the notebook. "Your notes are much better organized than mine were." "That's probably because Hermione reorganized them for me," Harry admitted, settling beside her against the wall. "I think she got tired of watching me flip through pages looking for anything useful." Katie laughed, the sound echoing softly in the empty corridor. "That sounds like Hermione, always trying to improve everyone's study habits, whether they want help or not." They were standing close enough that Harry could smell Katie's familiar shampoo, close enough that he could see the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled. It was maddening, being this near to her and having to maintain careful distances, having to resist the urge to reach out and touch her the way he wanted to. "Katie," he said quietly, "I was thinking, maybe we could go somewhere more private. To talk, I mean." Katie's expression grew more serious, but not in a way that suggested reluctance. "The room of requirement. If you want to, I just—" Harry struggled to find words for the frustration that had been building over the past 2 weeks. "I miss being able to talk to you properly, without having to worry about who might see us or what conclusions they might draw." "I know," Katie said softly. "I miss it too." She walked to the blank stretch of wall that concealed the entrance to the room of requirement, closing her eyes and concentrating on whatever she needed most. When she opened them again, a door had appeared, simple and unremarkable, the kind of door that might lead to a cozy study or a small sitting room. The space beyond was exactly what Harry had hoped for, comfortable and intimate without being presumptuous, with soft chairs arranged near a fireplace and warm light that made everything feel safe and private. It was clearly a room designed for conversation, for the kind of honest communication that had been difficult to manage in corridors and empty classrooms. "This is perfect," Harry said, as Katie settled into one of the chairs. "I thought you might like it," Katie said with a small smile. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about missing our study sessions. This felt like a good compromise, somewhere we can actually talk without constantly looking over our shoulders." Harry took the chair across from her, close enough to see the way the firelight played across her features, but far enough away to maintain the careful physical distance that their secret relationship seemed to require. It was a balance he was still learning to navigate, this space between the intimacy he wanted and the caution that circumstances demanded. "How are you settling back in?" Harry asked, though it was a question he'd wanted to ask for days. "Really, I mean, not the version you give everyone else when they ask." Katie was quiet for a moment, considering her answer with the kind of thoughtfulness that had drawn Harry to her in the first place. "It's harder than I expected," she said finally. "Not the coursework or the routine. That's actually been comforting, getting back to normal activities. But there's this constant awareness now of how fragile everything is, how quickly things can change." Harry nodded, understanding the feeling all too well. He'd been living with that awareness for years, the knowledge that safety was temporary, and that the people he cared about could be taken away without warning. "Do you regret coming back?" he asked quietly. "No," Katie said without hesitation. "Being away was worse. At least here I can see what's happening, can make my own choices about what risks I want to take. At home, I was just waiting and worrying and feeling helpless. And this?" Harry gestured between them, encompassing whatever their relationship was becoming. "Do you regret this?" Katie's expression grew softer, more vulnerable than she'd allowed it to be in public since her return. "No, Harry, I don't regret this at all. If anything, it's the one part of being back that feels completely right." The admission sent warmth spreading through Harry's chest, a feeling that was becoming familiar whenever Katie revealed how much their connection meant to her. "I was worried," Harry said honestly, "that maybe the letters had been, I don't know, a product of being isolated and bored, and that once you got back to normal life, you might feel differently." "Did you feel differently once I got back?" Katie asked. Harry considered the question seriously, thinking about the past 2 weeks of stolen moments and careful distances, and the growing certainty that what he felt for Katie was deeper and more substantial than anything he'd experienced before. "The opposite," he said quietly. "If anything, I feel more certain about this than I did before." Katie smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Harry forget why they were trying to keep their relationship secret in the first place. "Good," she said, "because I feel the same way." They talked for over an hour, curled into their chairs by the fire, sharing the kind of honest conversation that had become impossible in the public spaces of Hogwarts. Katie told him about her lingering anxiety around crowds, the way she sometimes felt disconnected from her own body in the aftermath of the curse. Harry shared his growing concerns about Dumbledore's mysterious absences and the private lessons that left him with more questions than answers. But more than the serious topics, they talked about everyday things. Katie's amusement at the way her dormmates had reorganized her belongings while she was away, Harry's ongoing struggles with advanced potions, their shared observations about the subtle changes in their classmates as the war drew closer to their daily lives. It was the kind of conversation they'd been having through letters for weeks, but there was something magical about being in the same room, about being able to see each other's expressions and hear the nuances of tone that written words couldn't capture. "I should probably head back," Katie said eventually, though she made no move to leave her chair. "Alicia will start wondering where I've gone if I'm out too late." "Probably," Harry agreed, though he was equally reluctant to end the evening. They stood at the same time, and suddenly they were much closer than they had been while sitting. Close enough that Harry could see the way Katie's breath caught slightly, close enough that the careful distance they'd been maintaining seemed artificial and unnecessary. "Katie," Harry said softly, and she looked up at him with an expression that was both questioning and hopeful. "Yeah?" Instead of answering with words, Harry reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away. When she didn't, when she moved closer instead, he cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her. This kiss was different from their first one in the corridor, deeper, more confident, uninterrupted by the fear of discovery. Katie's hands came up to rest against his chest, and she kissed him back with a sweetness that made Harry's head spin. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing unsteadily. "I've been wanting to do that for 2 weeks," Harry admitted quietly. "Only 2 weeks?" Katie asked with a small smile. "I've been thinking about it since our first study session in the library." The revelation that Katie had been interested in him for longer than he'd realized should have been surprising, but instead it felt like a missing piece clicking into place. All those moments he'd second-guessed, all those glances he'd wondered if he was imagining, they'd been real, and they'd been mutual. "Why didn't you say anything?" Harry asked. "Because you were Harry Potter, and I was just another Gryffindor on the Quidditch team," Katie said matter-of-factly. "Because I thought you were interested in Ginny, and even if you weren't, I couldn't imagine you'd look twice at someone like me." "Someone like you?" "Someone ordinary," Katie said, though there was no self-pity in her voice, just honesty. "Someone without a famous name, or a tragic backstory, or a crucial role in the war against you-know-who." Harry stared at her, wondering how someone as extraordinary as Katie Bell could possibly think of herself as ordinary. "Katie," he said seriously, "you're the least ordinary person I know. You're brave and intelligent and funny, and you see straight through all the nonsense that everyone else gets distracted by. You make everything better, just by being part of it." Katie's eyes filled with tears that she blinked away quickly. "You don't have to." "I'm not saying it because I have to," Harry interrupted. "I'm saying it because it's true. Because I need you to understand that when I look at you, I don't see someone ordinary. I see the person who found me crying after a Quidditch match and stayed to help instead of walking away. I see the person who wrote me letters that kept me sane during the worst weeks of my life. I see the person who came back to Hogwarts despite everything that happened because she refused to hide from her own life." Katie was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft with emotion. "I love you," she said simply. The words hit Harry like a stunning spell, knocking the breath from his lungs and making his heart race. He'd been falling in love with Katie Bell for weeks, but hearing her say it first, hearing the certainty in her voice, made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. "I love you too," he said, and the words felt like a revelation, like finally admitting something to himself that he'd been dancing around for months. They kissed again, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful maintenance of distance. This time, Harry allowed himself to hold Katie the way he'd been wanting to, and she melted into his embrace with a sigh that spoke of weeks of restrained affection, finally finding its outlet. When they finally separated, they were both smiling with the kind of joy that felt too big to contain. "So," Katie said, her voice slightly unsteady but warm with happiness, "I guess we're doing this?" "I guess we are," Harry agreed. The next few weeks fell into a pattern that became as familiar and necessary as breathing. Days filled with the careful choreography of public friendship, punctuated by stolen moments that felt all the more precious for being secret. Evening meetings in the room of requirement became routine, a space where they could be honest about their feelings without fear of discovery or judgment. Harry learned things about Katie that he'd never had the opportunity to observe before. The way she hummed under her breath when she was concentrating, the way she curled up in her chair with her legs tucked under her when she was completely relaxed, the way she laughed with her whole body when something genuinely amused her. Small, intimate details that felt like treasures to be gathered and stored away. Katie, meanwhile, seemed to be learning similar things about Harry. She noticed when his nightmares were worse, offering quiet comfort without demanding explanations. She recognized when his lessons with Dumbledore had been particularly difficult, creating distractions and gentle conversations that helped him process whatever he'd learned without having to discuss the specifics. It was during one of these post-lesson conversations that Harry realized how naturally Katie had integrated into his inner circle, how seamlessly she'd become part of the small group of people who really understood the weight he carried. "You don't have to tell me what you talked about," Katie said as they sat together in the room of requirement, Harry's head resting against her shoulder while she ran her fingers through his hair. "But you look like you've seen something that bothered you." Harry had just returned from a particularly intense memory session with Dumbledore, one that had revealed disturbing details about Voldemort's past and his creation of Horcruxes. The information was too dangerous and too important to share casually, but the emotional weight of it was threatening to overwhelm him. "It's complicated," Harry said quietly, "and dangerous. The kind of information that puts people at risk just by knowing it." "Then don't tell me the specifics," Katie said simply. "Just tell me how it made you feel." It was such a characteristically Katie response. Practical, compassionate, focused on what actually mattered, rather than what might be interesting to know. Harry found himself able to talk about his fears and frustrations without revealing any of the strategic details that needed to remain secret. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in other people's choices," he admitted. "Like everything that's happening now is the result of decisions made by people who are dead or gone, and I'm just supposed to clean up the mess they left behind." "That must be exhausting," Katie said, her fingers continuing their soothing movement through his hair. "It is," Harry said, surprised by how much relief he felt, just having someone acknowledge the burden. "And the worst part is that I can't even be angry about it, because most of those people made the best choices they could with the information they had. It's not their fault that the situation is so complicated. You're allowed to be angry about your circumstances without blaming the people who created them, Katie said gently. You're allowed to wish your life was different, even if you understand why it can't be. The simple permission to feel frustrated, coming from someone who understood him so well, was exactly what Harry needed. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, Katie's presence serving as an anchor against the storm of emotions that his lessons with Dumbledore always stirred up. "I'm glad you're here," Harry said eventually. "Where else would I be?" Katie asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested the question was more than casual. Harry lifted his head to look at her, studying her expression in the warm light of the room of requirement. "I mean, I'm glad you chose to come back to Hogwarts. I'm glad you chose to take the risk of being here instead of staying somewhere safe." "Harry," Katie said seriously, "there is nowhere safe anymore. The war is everywhere, whether we're here at school or hidden away at home. The difference is that here, I get to choose how I face it. Here, I get to be with the people I care about, instead of just waiting and worrying." The matter-of-fact way she discussed the war and its implications reminded Harry of why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. Katie didn't minimize the dangers they faced, but she didn't let those dangers paralyze her either. She found ways to build happiness and connection despite the darkness that surrounded them. "I love you," Harry said, the words coming easily now that they'd started saying them to each other. "I love you too," Katie replied, leaning down to kiss him softly. It was during moments like these, quiet, intimate, removed from the pressures of the outside world, that Harry could almost forget about prophecies and Horcruxes and the weight of expectations that followed him everywhere. In the room of requirement with Katie, he could be just Harry, someone who was learning what it meant to love and be loved in return. But the outside world had a way of intruding, even into their most private moments. "Harry," Katie said during one of their evening meetings, her voice carrying a note of concern that immediately put him on alert. "I've been thinking about something, and I need to ask you about it." They were sitting together on the couch the room had provided, Katie curled against Harry's side, in a position that had become natural and comfortable. But there was tension in her posture, now that suggested whatever she wanted to discuss was serious. "What is it?" Harry asked. "Ron and Hermione know about us," Katie said. "They've made it clear that they're supportive, and I trust them completely. But I'm wondering, are there other people we should be telling? People who might be hurt if they find out from someone else?" Harry considered the question, thinking through the various relationships that might be affected by the revelation of their romance. "You mean like Ginny?" "Among others," Katie said carefully. "I know you and Ginny have history, and I don't want her to feel like she's been replaced or dismissed. And there are people on the Quidditch team who might feel awkward about the captain dating one of the players." The practical concerns were valid, and Harry appreciated Katie's thoughtfulness in bringing them up. But underlying her questions was a larger issue that they'd been avoiding: how long they could maintain their secrecy before it became more of a burden than a protection. "Are you ready to tell people?" Harry asked. "I thought you wanted to keep this private while you adjusted to being back." "I did," Katie said, "and it's been good to have this space to figure out what we mean to each other, without outside pressure. But I'm starting to feel like the secrecy is creating more complications than it's solving." Harry knew what she meant. The careful distances, the performed casualness, the constant awareness of who might be watching. It was all becoming exhausting in ways that were affecting their ability to simply enjoy being together. "What do you want to do?" Harry asked. Katie was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "I think I want to start telling people. Not a big announcement or anything dramatic. Just letting our friends know, being honest about what this is." The suggestion filled Harry with a mixture of relief and nervousness. Relief at the prospect of not having to hide his feelings for Katie anymore. nervousness about the inevitable gossip and speculation that would follow the revelation that Harry Potter was in a relationship. "All right," he said. "Let's do it. Let's tell people." Katie smiled, the expression bright with relief and anticipation. "Really?" "Really," Harry confirmed. "Though maybe we start with the people who matter most and work our way out from there." "That sounds perfect," Katie said, leaning up to kiss him. "Thank you for being patient with all of this. I know the secrecy hasn't been easy." "It was worth it," Harry said honestly. "Getting to figure this out with you, getting to know you without everyone else's opinions and expectations getting in the way, it was worth every bit of awkwardness." As they walked back to Gryffindor Tower that night, Harry found himself looking forward to the conversations that lay ahead. Telling Ginny about his relationship with Katie would probably be awkward, and there would undoubtedly be some tension around the Quidditch team dynamics. But there would also be relief in being able to acknowledge publicly what had become the most important relationship in his life. The war was getting closer, the danger was increasing, and every day brought new evidence that their time as students was running out. In the face of that reality, hiding his love for Katie Bell seemed not just unnecessary, but actively wasteful. Life was too short and too uncertain to spend it pretending that the best thing in his world didn't exist. Chapter 8. The Cave. Harry found Katie in the room of requirement, curled in her usual chair by the fire, with a Transfiguration textbook open on her lap, though he could tell from her expression that she wasn't actually reading. She looked up when he entered, and her face lit up with the kind of smile that still made his chest feel tight with affection, even after weeks of secret meetings and whispered conversations. "You're early," she said, setting aside her book and reaching for his hands as he settled into the chair beside her. "I wasn't expecting you until after dinner." Harry laced their fingers together, studying Katie's face in the warm light of the fire and trying to memorize the details. The way her hair caught the golden glow, the small scar on her chin that he'd learned to trace with his thumb, the particular shade of contentment in her dark eyes when they were alone like this. "I wanted to see you," he said quietly. "Before—" He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Before what? Before he left with Dumbledore on a mission he couldn't explain, to retrieve something he couldn't name, for reasons that were too dangerous and too complex to share even with the person he trusted most? Katie's expression grew more serious as she picked up on his hesitation. "Harry, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, exactly," Harry said, though even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Something was wrong. Had been wrong for weeks now, building like a storm on the horizon. Dumbledore's lessons had grown more intense, more urgent, filled with memories and revelations that painted an increasingly desperate picture of the war they were losing. And tonight, finally, they were going to do something about it. "I have to go somewhere tonight," Harry said carefully. "With Dumbledore. I can't tell you where or why, but it might be dangerous." Katie's hands tightened around his. "How dangerous?" Harry considered lying, offering some reassuring platitude about routine business and minimal risk. But Katie deserved better than that. She'd been honest with him about her fears and vulnerabilities. The least he could do was return the favor. "I don't know," he admitted. "Dumbledore says it's important. Essential, actually. But he also warned me that it wouldn't be safe." Katie was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing patterns on the back of Harry's hand in a gesture that was probably meant to be comforting, but instead made him acutely aware of how much he had to lose. "When?" she asked finally. "Soon. Maybe within the hour." Harry paused, studying her face. "I wanted to see you first. To tell you, in case something goes wrong." "Nothing's going to go wrong," Katie said firmly, though there was something in her voice that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "Dumbledore knows what he's doing, and you're careful. You'll both come back." Harry wanted to believe her, but he'd learned not to trust in happy endings. Too many people he'd cared about had walked out of his life with similar reassurances, only to never return. "Katie," he said quietly, "if something does happen—" "Don't!" Katie interrupted, her voice sharp with sudden fear. "Don't say goodbye to me like you're not coming back. Don't make this feel like an ending." Harry looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her eyes had gone bright with unshed tears, the fierce protectiveness in her expression that was directed entirely at him. When had Katie Bell become someone who could make him want to fight harder to survive, just for the chance to see her face again? "I love you," he said instead of goodbye, and Katie's expression softened into something that was both relief and heartbreak. "I love you too," she whispered. "Come back to me." Harry kissed her then, soft and desperate and full of all the things he couldn't say. When they broke apart, Katie rested her forehead against his, and they sat in silence for several minutes, holding each other in the warm light of the fire and pretending that the world outside this room didn't exist. "I should go," Harry said eventually, though every part of him wanted to stay. "I know," Katie said quietly. "But Harry, be careful. Please, I just got you. I'm not ready to lose you." The raw honesty in her voice nearly undid him. Harry stood reluctantly, Katie rising with him, and for a moment they just looked at each other, both trying to commit the moment to memory. "I'll see you later," Harry said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You'd better," Katie replied, and then she was kissing him again, fierce and claiming, as if she could anchor him to her through sheer force of will. When Harry finally left the room of requirement, he carried the taste of Katie's kiss with him, like a talisman, against whatever darkness awaited him and Dumbledore. Katie remained in the room of requirement long after Harry left, staring into the fire and trying to quiet the growing sense of dread that had settled in her chest. She'd meant what she'd said about Dumbledore knowing what he was doing, about Harry being careful, but that didn't stop her from imagining all the ways that dangerous missions could go wrong. She tried reading, tried working on her ancient runes translation, tried anything that might distract her from the clock on the mantelpiece that seemed to be moving with deliberate slowness. By 9 o'clock, she'd given up on productive activities and was simply sitting, staring at the door and hoping that Harry might return early with news that whatever they'd needed to do had been accomplished quickly and safely. By 10 o'clock, the knot of anxiety in her stomach had grown into something approaching panic. By 11, Katie had decided that waiting alone was making everything worse. She left the room of requirement and made her way back to Gryffindor Tower, hoping that company might help pass the time until Harry returned. She found Ron and Hermione in the common room, bent over what appeared to be a complicated arithmancy problem, though they looked up with relief when she approached. "Katie," Hermione said, "perfect timing. Can you help us figure out this calculation? I think we're missing something obvious, but we've been staring at it for so long that nothing makes sense anymore." Katie settled beside them on the couch, grateful for the distraction, even though she could barely focus on the numbers and symbols covering Hermione's parchment. "What are you trying to calculate?" "Magical resonance patterns in theoretical curse breaking," Ron said, with the air of someone who was thoroughly sick of the entire subject. "It's for our defense against the dark arts independent study. Hermione thought it would be intellectually stimulating." "It is intellectually stimulating," Hermione protested. "And it's practical knowledge that we might actually need someday." Katie tried to follow their explanation of the problem, but her mind kept drifting to Harry and wherever he'd gone with Dumbledore. "Dangerous," he'd said. "Essential, but not safe." The combination was enough to make her stomach twist with worry. "Katie?" Ron's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Are you all right? You look like you're about to be sick." "I'm fine," Katie said automatically, then caught the concerned expressions on both her friends' faces. Ron and Hermione knew about her relationship with Harry, had known for weeks actually, though they'd been discreetly supportive rather than nosy about the details. If anyone would understand her current anxiety, it would be them. "Harry's gone somewhere with Dumbledore," she said quietly. "Something dangerous. He couldn't tell me what. But he looked scared. Really scared in a way I've never seen before." Hermione set down her quill, giving Katie her full attention. "When did they leave?" "A few hours ago. He said they might be gone most of the night, but I can't stop thinking about all the ways things could go wrong." "Harry's been through dangerous situations before," Ron said gently. "And he's with Dumbledore. There's nobody more capable of keeping him safe." Katie nodded, knowing Ron was right, but unable to shake the feeling that this time was different. This time felt final somehow, like whatever Harry and Dumbledore were doing tonight would change everything. They tried to return to their homework, but none of them could concentrate properly. By midnight, they'd given up all pretense of studying and were simply sitting together, making desultory conversation and checking the clock every few minutes. It was nearly 1 in the morning when they heard it. A sound like distant thunder, followed by shouts and running footsteps in the corridors outside. Katie's blood went cold as she recognized the unmistakable sounds of emergency, of crisis, of something terrible happening within the walls of Hogwarts. "What?" Hermione began, but her words were cut off by a voice amplified by magic, echoing through the castle. "All students return to your dormitories immediately. This is not a drill. Teachers to your stations." McGonagall's voice, tight with barely controlled panic, confirming Katie's worst fears. Something was wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. Ron was already moving toward the portrait hole. "We have to find out what's happening." "Ron, no!" Hermione said sharply. "McGonagall said to stay in our dormitories." "McGonagall said that before she knew Harry was missing," Katie said, standing and reaching for her wand. "If something's happened to him—" "Katie," Hermione said gently, "we don't know that anything's happened to Harry specifically. This could be anything." But even as she spoke, they could all hear the sounds of battle growing closer, curses being cast, furniture overturning, the distinct crashes that came with magical combat, and underneath it all, a sound that made Katie's blood freeze, the cackling laughter of Bellatrix Lestrange, Death Eaters, in Hogwarts, while Harry was gone and unable to defend himself or anyone else. "I'm going out there," Katie said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Katie, that's suicide," Ron said, though he was gripping his own wand and looking toward the portrait hole with the same desperate need to act. "Maybe," Katie agreed, "but I'm not going to sit here while people I care about are fighting for their lives. And I'm especially not going to hide while there's a chance that Harry might come back in the middle of this mess." She could see the moment when Ron and Hermione reached the same conclusion she had, that waiting safely in the common room while their friends faced Death Eaters was not actually an option. "Right then," Ron said grimly, "let's go get ourselves killed." The corridors of Hogwarts had been transformed into a war zone. Suits of armor lay in pieces, tapestries hung in scorched tatters, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of curses. Katie had been in fights before, Quidditch brawls, dueling practice, even the incident with the cursed necklace, but nothing had prepared her for the surreal horror of seeing her school under attack. They made their way toward the sounds of battle, wands raised and nerves stretched tight with adrenaline. Katie's training kicked in. Years of Quidditch had taught her to think quickly under pressure, to anticipate threats and react instinctively to danger. But this was different from sport. This was life and death, with no rules and no referees to ensure fair play. "There!" Hermione whispered, pointing toward the entrance hall where flashes of colored light suggested an active duel. They crept closer, staying low and trying to remain unseen. What they found was chaos. members of the Order of the Phoenix fighting desperately against a smaller group of Death Eaters who seemed to be trying to reach the upper floors of the castle. Katie recognized Lupin and Tonks among the defenders, along with several other witches and wizards she'd seen at Order meetings but couldn't name. And there, in the center of the melee, was Professor McGonagall, dueling with a vicious efficiency that Katie had never imagined her capable of. "We have to help them," Ron said, starting forward, but Hermione caught his arm. "We need to be smart about this. We're outnumbered and undertrained. If we just charge in, we'll make things worse." Katie was about to argue when she saw something that made her heart stop. Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf who'd nearly killed Bill Weasley, was creeping along the wall toward where Professor McGonagall was dueling, clearly intending to attack her from behind. Without thinking, Katie raised her wand and cast the strongest stunning spell she could manage. Her aim was true. Greyback crumpled to the ground, his sneak attack thwarted, but her intervention had also revealed their position to the other Death Eaters. "Students!" one of them snarled, turning toward their hiding spot. "Kill them!" What followed was the most terrifying 5 minutes of Katie's life. Curses flew around them, some missing by inches, others deflected only by quick thinking and quicker reflexes. She found herself fighting alongside Ron and Hermione, with a desperation born of absolute necessity, all thoughts of self-preservation forgotten in the face of immediate danger. It was Ron who ended it, hitting their attacker with a perfectly aimed reductor curse that sent the Death Eater flying backward into a stone pillar. The man hit with a sickening crack and didn't get up. "Is he?" Katie began, but Hermione was already checking for signs of life. "Unconscious," she said with relief. "Badly hurt, but alive." The sounds of battle were fading now, suggesting that the immediate crisis was passing. Katie could hear McGonagall giving orders, coordinating the response to whatever had just happened. But underneath the relief, a new fear was growing. Where were Harry and Dumbledore? Why had Death Eaters been able to enter Hogwarts so easily? And what had they been trying to accomplish? "Katie! Ron! Hermione!" The voice belonged to Professor McGonagall, who was approaching them with an expression of mingled relief and exasperation. "What are you doing out of your dormitories? I gave explicit orders. We heard the fighting," Katie said, before Ron or Hermione could answer. "We couldn't just hide while people were in danger." McGonagall's expression softened slightly. "While I understand the sentiment, you could have been killed. This was not a situation for students to involve themselves in." "With respect, Professor," Katie said, surprising herself with her boldness. "We're not children anymore. We're 17 years old, we're trained in defensive magic, and this is our school. Where else would we be?" McGonagall studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair point, Miss Bell. Though I hope you understand that your involvement tonight must remain between us. The last thing we need is other students deciding to play hero." Katie nodded, though she was barely listening. Her attention was fixed on the entrance to the castle, waiting for any sign of Harry and Dumbledore's return. As the minutes stretched on with no sign of them, her anxiety grew into something approaching terror.